This page then looks like the front cover of N64 Magazine, must be around June 98, issue 16, right in your face with adventure games, isn't it? Banjo-Kazooie is the main event. Rare's Bear takes on the N64's newest stars. Typical magazine overexcitement for a Rare game, wasn't it? And then there's GEX64, Enter the Gecko. They're calling it a surprise summer smash? Bit much maybe. Looks like they're claiming world exclusive, over 50 new shots. For GEX2, must have been a slow news week. At the bottom, they've got new adventures in 3D, with little screenshots for Holy Magic Century, Forsaken, Rampage World Tour, and even World Cup 98. Yeah, classic N64 mag cover, takes you back. This page is an introduction to N64 Magazine, letting you know how they operate, like a bit of a mission statement really. There's a massive picture of Gex the Gecko, you remember him? Cheeky little lizard. It's all about how they are independent and honest, saying they won't just give out top scores willy-nilly until they've properly played a game through. Bit of a dig at other mags who might be a bit too cozy with the game companies perhaps. They reckon they can give honest reviews because they aren't in Nintendo's pocket, and they will call a game awful if it is. Which, fair enough, that's what you want, isn't it? They also say they cover games from Japan and America, so you know what's coming out, not just stuff for the Japanese market. Apparently their writers are proper Nintendo fans, so they know their stuff and are giving decent advice. Down at the bottom, there's a thumbnail of the magazine cover itself, showing Banjo-Kazooie and Gex64, both big hitters back then, can't deny that. And there's a photo of James Ashton, the editor, giving you the spiel. They're promising a happier editorial service next month, whatever that means. Sounds like they had a bit of a mare this month, bit cryptic. Overall, it's them saying they're on your side, the gamer's side, and trying to be straight with you about what's worth your hard-earned cash. This page is the contents page for issue 16 of N64 Magazine from June 1998. Right on the front, it's shouting about Gex64, Enter the Gecko, as the main feature. Looks like they reckon it's going to be the big summer game. Remember Gex? Yeah, the wisecracking gecko. Bit of a 90s mascot fad, that one. It's promising new adventures in 3D, so I suppose they're hoping it'll be a platformer to rival Mario or Banjo. We'll see about that. Bit of a no. Then there's the N64 Arena section, which is their reviews and stuff. World Cup 98 is in there. Must be time for the football games to start appearing with the real World Cup just around the corner. They're asking if it's an ISS 64 beta, so still comparing everything to International Superstar Soccer, even on the N64. Must be. Aero Fighters Assault gets a mention, saying it's a border-tastic PL version that appeared in shops secretly. Sounds a bit dodgy. Perhaps some import game shenanigans going on there. Forsaken is next. Something about it being like Tunnel B1, which was alright I suppose. A bit of a shoot-'em-up. Then there's Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey 98, so the yearly update for that. Wonder if it's much different from the last one. They're joking about it being a mugging, so maybe not amazing then. And lastly, in the Arena section, Rampage World Tour. Another blast from the arcade past. Yonks old arcade game but playable. Apparently an ape-filled destruction fest. Well, it is Rampage. Over in the import arena, they've got Airborder 64, which they call Weird Surf-em-up. Sounds a bit niche. And finally, Jeopardy, saying it's worse than Wheel of Fortune, which doesn't sound too promising for a game show game, does it? So that's what's inside this issue then. This page is the contents page for the magazine. Right then, let's have a look. Aang. So kicking things off, we've got a Future Look special. Gang. Always good to see what's coming up. Banjo-Kazooie is flagged as the big 3D adventure, yeah. That was going to be massive, wasn't it? Then there's Earthworm Jim 3D. Poor Jim. Things went a bit odd in the 3D transition for him, didn't they? Space Circus sounds a bit generic. It's in space, there's a circus, okay then. Buck Bumble. Bees and gun-firing butterflies, right you are. Very N64 that. 12 Tails. Conker 64, listed as, not Mr. Nuts, foreshadowing the adult turn that took, eh? Antonic Trouble. No limbs, no neck, but full of fun. Blimey. Moving on to the how-to section, always helpful for those tricky bits. Live happily ever after in Yoshi's story. It was lovely and fluffy, alright. Good for the younger gamers, perhaps. Defeat the stage plan in Mystical Ninja. Now that was a bit of a weird one, but fun. Needed all the help you could get with that. Discover every last secret in Quake. Finding all those secrets and shamblers, memories. And choose and use your import converter cart. Essential back then if you were impatient and wanted to play games from other regions. Remember all that faff? Planet 64 News Center has the latest news. Wipeout 64 and E3. GoldenEye sequel talk. ISS 64 being cheaper. And Dattles, 64DD peripheral, the 64DD, never really took off, did it? Coming soon. Teases Rat Attack, Rakuga Kids, Legend of the River King and F-Zero X. F-Zero X was a proper speedfest, wasn't it? Then there's a chance to win an N64 and a copy of Quake. Scare the living daylights out of us, sounds about right. Regular features include the Information Station, Tips Extra, N64 Shopper for where to spend your pocket money, Club 64 Feet for letters, subscriptions, back issues, a directory, and N64 Magazine issue 17 feet for general contact stuff. Lastly, Weird Science, the chemistry of great games, asking what makes a game great, comparing GoldenEye to Hexen. That's a proper debate starter right there. This page is a future look special from N64 Magazine, and it's all about upcoming 3D adventure games for the N64. Blimey, 1998. Feels like ages ago now, doesn't it? They've got Banjo-Kazooie plastered all over the front, that bear and bird duo, looking a bit cheeky as always. It says, new adventures in 3D, so that's the general vibe. Gay. Then they jump straight into Gex. Remember Gex? The gecko with the telly obsession. Seems like he's back, and this is an exclusive preview for the N64. They've got screenshots, one from a NYPD Blue level core. Blimey, even back then TV shows were leaking into games. Apparently you're collecting police badges in that one. Another screenshot is from an underwater level that's supposed to be exclusive to the N64 version. They're banging on about how smooth Gex looks, something called skinning, to smooth off the polygons. And they're even comparing the fogging to the PlayStation version, saying the N64 does it better without banding. Bit of console war stuff there, eh? There's also a bit about collectible coins of commendation rating. Right, so basically coins are in platform games. Groundbreaking stuff. They're N64 coins this time, and apparently you're meant to count them to see how good the game is. Bit of a daft rating system if you ask me. Still, it's Gex. It was alright back in the day, a bit of a laugh. They say he can twist and turn, and he's packed with custom moves. Sounds like typical platformer stuff, really. Issue 16, page 6. N64 Magazine. Happy days. This page is all about Gex 64. Enter the gecko for the N64. Looks like a preview in the future look section. So they're saying Crystal Dynamics, the guys behind it, are trying to make a sequel that can actually compete with Super Mario 64. Bit of a tall order that, wasn't it? They're saying it's a tough job because Mario really set the standard for platformers in 3D, didn't he? Apparently only Mystical Ninja on the N64 and some unnamed game on the PlayStation have really nailed 3D gaming properly up to this point, according to this article. They reckon Gex 3D, which was on the PlayStation, was alright, but not amazing. Now they're trying to make Gex 64 something special on the N64, because on the PlayStation, it was easier to look good compared to games like Croc, Rascal, and Bubsy. Ouch. Bit harsh on Bubsy, but to really shine on the N64, you have to be something else, or just copy Mario basically. Looks like Gex might have some climbing ability, according to one of the captions by a screenshot, which they say is enormously helpful, understatement if you ask me. There are a couple of screenshots, one looks like a desert or temple kind of level, and another one is a bit darker, maybe a cave or something. Release date says August in the US and October here in the UK, so not too far off then. Seems like they are cautiously optimistic about it. Let's see if Gekomex can actually balance those scales, as the headline says. This page is about Gex 64. Enter the Gecko, seems like a preview in N64 Magazine, issue 16 back in '98. It's titled New Adventures in 3D, which was a big deal then. 3D gaming was still quite new on consoles. The article reckons Gex 64 is all about this media dimension map, bit like Mario 64's castle, but with telesets. Apparently you jump into the TVs to get to different levels. Sounds fairly standard for the time, collect stuff and jump through levels. They mention it's non-linear, which was probably trying to be a selling point. They're banging on about the analog controls, calling them beautiful, which yeah, N64 controllers were pretty good for 3D movement compared to what we had before. Apparently you're collecting remote controls red, silver and gold to get to bonus stages. Sounds like typical collectathon stuff. The levels are themed around movie genres. They list Indiana Jones, Star Wars, James Bond, horror films, Kung Fu, Jurassic Park, NYPD Blue. Blimey, they really crammed it in. They're saying each level is full of references and parodies. Sounds like it's trying to be a bit clever and funny, especially with Leslie Phillips doing the voiceover. Remember him? Ding dong, Crenshaw. There are a few screenshots. One shows Gex in a water level, looking alright, nothing mind-blowing. Another one has him in a darker level with a skull in the background. Maybe horror-themed. The last one is Gex, fighting some monster. They caption it like the Goonies. This is a bit whoa. Bit cheesy that. The reviewer seems to be quite positive, saying it's got brilliantly diverse levels, gorgeous visuals, putty-like controls, and a fabulous sense of humor. They're wondering if it could be a surprise summer smash, Bit keen, aren't they? They mention it's not trying to steal Mario's crown, but it's a good alternative. Overall, sounds like they were fairly impressed with gex 64 back then, thought it could be a decent platformer for the N64. This page in N64 Magazine, right, is having a chat with Glenn Schofield, the bloke in charge of gex 64. Enter the Gecko. They're calling it, Let's Talk About gex, with a little subtitle about dodgy lip-syncing and Leslie Phillips, bit of a name from back in the day. The feature starts by talking about how they approached gex 64 as a sequel, but tried to make it feel like a brand new game, bringing the character into 3D. Apparently Crystal Dynamics had been working on 3D stuff, and they wanted to update gex and make him more relevant for us Brits, hence the James Bond parody angle, which is quite a shift they reckon. There's a bit about the game's humour, saying they based it on The Simpsons, and one of the writers from that show even worked on the gex 64 script. They mention that they pulled comedy inspiration from different generations, from Bond films to Boy George, bit of an odd mix that. Then it moves on to the lip-syncing, or lack thereof, in the Kung Fu sections. Apparently they were doing it on purpose for a laugh, but playtesters didn't get it, so they binned it. They're hoping to bring it back in the future though, which sounds like a right pain to animate if you ask me. No. Next up, they ask about getting Leslie Phillips involved. Turns out they had a talent search in the UK and listened to loads of tapes, but Leslie Phillips was the top choice. They thought he was the right voice to evolve gex into a likeable rogue, which yeah, Leslie Phillips, he's got that sort of charm. Apparently he's done over 100 films, the interviewer's impressed. Bit of an exaggeration perhaps, but he's certainly been in a few. The page touches on the media references in the game. Each world is based on a media theme, like Kung Fu films with Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee, Space World with space movies, Prehistoric World inspired by Jurassic Park, and a cartoon world based on Warner cartoons. They were trying to mix it up so you didn't get bored of just one theme, which makes sense I suppose, keeps things fresh. They're proud of the 3D levels and managing polygons, making the most of the N64 hardware. There's a question about how they innovated in the platformer genre, given Mario 64 was the big benchmark. They reckon gex has his tail attack, wall climbing, and that tongue grapple hook thing as his unique bits, and they've tried to build on that for a different experience. Finally, they talk about differences between the N64 and PlayStation and PC versions. The N64 version will have 2 exclusive levels that the others won't, and they're still being made, but they hint that underwater stuff will be involved. Intriguing, yeah. There are a couple of screenshots scattered around showing gex in different world themes, one with a Star Wars type vibe, another prehistoric jungle, and one that looks a bit like an Indiana Jones set. Standard platforming fare, with a bit of character dialogue in boxes next to them, nothing too groundbreaking visually, but it's early days for 3D platformers on the N64 still, in it. They've slapped a collectible coins of commendation rating of 4.5 gold coins at the bottom, which is pretty good for then I suppose. Overall it's a decent preview, makes the game sound alright, we'll have to wait and see if it's any good when it actually comes out mind. This page is all about Banjo-Kazooie. In it, it's screaming new adventures in 3D right at you, which back in '98 was a pretty big deal. Everyone was going 3D mad. There's Banjo the bear himself grinning away, and Kazooie the bird poking his head out the backpack, looking a bit cheeky as always. It's a proper jungle setting they've got going on, like they're showing off the lush graphics, which to be fair, were quite something for the N64 at the time. It's got that future look thing on the side, so you know they're trying to build up the excitement for it, see what's coming next for the console generation. Issue 16 by the looks of it, so they were still fairly early in the N64's life. It's just a front cover page, getting you hyped for the game, typical magazine stuff really. This page is a look ahead at Banjo-Kazooie, which they reckon could be Game of the Year, until Zelda turns up anyway. Cheeky. It's a rare game, so you knew it would be a looker even back then. The article says it's in the final stages of playtesting, and they're pretty confident about releasing some details. Apparently the story is about an evil witch called Gruntilda, who's kidnapped Tooty, Banjo's sister, because she's jealous she came second in a beauty contest. Banjo, bless him, decides to rescue her with his mate Kazooie, who's a bird in his rucksack. How original. They're saying the game is set across 9 worlds, and you collect puzzle pieces and musical notes, and even mumbo tokens and jingo birds, whatever they are. Typical Rare collectathon it sounds like. It reckons it'll take about 50 hours to see everything, which is a decent chunk of time. They even compare it to Mario 64, which is high praise indeed, isn't it? Gaha. There are a few screenshots dotted about. One shows some Egyptian-themed level, they call it Gorgeous Egyptian level, with pyramids and all that. Another shows Kazooie wearing Wellington boots, drain pipes they call them, and another with magic carpets, obviously the only way to get around Egypt they joke. And there's one in dark caves, with some sort of scary monster face. They say darkness, with a scary laugh. Bit dramatic, aren't they? Durr. It's all looking quite promising, mind. June 1998 release, they're saying, for both the US and the UK. Right then, let's see if it lives up to the hype when it finally lands. This page in N64 Magazine is having a gander at Banjo-Kazooie. Right then, what have we got? It's all about this bear and bird duo, Banjo and Kazooie. And it's a 3D platformer, naturally, because it's on the N64 and everything's 3D these days. They're showing off some bits, Kazooie using her wings to fly, even though she's got legs apparently. There's a shark in the water, doing a Jaws impression apparently, which is a bit of a laugh. And some birds that crash and burn, oh dear. They've got some weird Egyptian dog statue thing, and the witch Gruntilda is knocking back the potions again, probably causing trouble. Looks like you fight a monkey boss too, and punch him into the sky, which sounds a bit daft, but alright. The reviewer reckons it'll take about 35 hours to complete, which is a decent whack of time. They mention the buddy system, how you can swap between Banjo and Kazooie depending on what you need to do, like flying or running up hills. Apparently the water effects are top-notch, as good as Wave Ray 64, which were pretty swanky back then. The big question is, can it beat Mario 64? Bit of a bold claim, isn't it? They're saying it's technically impressive but need to play it more to really know. They reckon it's got potential and might just be the game to challenge Mario. We'll see, won't we? They're off to play it properly next month, and they're saying they can hardly wait. Getting a bit carried away there, aren't they? Still, looks promising, I suppose. This page is all about Banjo-Kazooie. Looks like a preview piece from back in the day. They're calling it Playing the Banjo, with a little play on words there, cheeky. It talks about how long the game's been cooking. Apparently the bear character was designed way back in '96, and Kazooie followed soon after. The actual team working on it at this point, which must be around June '98 going by the bottom, was about 13 people full-time, plus some other bits and bobs from Rare. They reckon some of the team had been at Rare for ages, like 10 years, and for others it was their first proper game project. They're saying it's inspired by Mario 64, trying to get that 3D world vibe, and mix it with what they did with Donkey Kong Country on the SNES, aiming for a younger audience mainly, but still trying to make it fun for us older gamers too, which is fair enough. Story-wise, it's the classic kidnap plot. Gruntilda the witch has nicked Banjo's sister Tooty, and wants to steal her youth and beauty. Bit of a cliché even then, innit? The worlds are accessed by jigsaw pictures, and you need to collect jigsaw pieces from different worlds to fill them in. There's also musical note doors, sealed by Gruntilda, and you have to collect enough notes to open them. Sounds like a collectathon, which was the style at the time. They ask about favourite characters, and they mention Banjo, Gruntilda the witch obviously, and they've tried to make her comical and incompetent, which is always good for a baddie. Then there's Gobi the camel, Blubber the hippo pirate, Mr. Vile the crocodile, and Boggy the polar bear. Quite a colourful bunch. For favourite bits in the game, they mention an eating contest with Mr. Vile the crocodile. Sounds a bit like those minigames they were starting to put in everything back then, hoping to add a bit of variety. They reckon it could take between 30 and 50 hours to finish the game first time round, but once you know your way about, you could probably blast through it in just 45 hours, which is typical, isn't it? They're finishing up by asking what makes Banjo-Kazooie special. And they're saying it's designed to appeal to all ages, and that the worlds are all different with their own objectives. They're clearly hoping it'll be another big Rare hit, following on from GoldenEye and Diddy Kong Racing and all those. They're giving it a collectible coins of commendation rating, and blimey, it's a full row of gold coins, top marks then. They were keen on those coins back then, weren't they? Anyway, yeah, Banjo-Kazooie, big game for the N64 at the time. Everyone was pretty hyped for it. This page covers Earthworm Jim 3D. Remember that one? It's got a feature called Out on a Gym, with Kirk Ewing from the dev team, who's the vice president of creative, so he's a proper important bloke. Apparently they had this idea to make it look 2D but in 3D, which sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? But they changed their minds and properly revamped the engine. They reckon Jim looks much better now, more dynamic and all that. They've given him some new toys too, like a shrink gun and a flower power gun, and a pump pack for super jumps using his BFR, beam fusion reactor. Very Jim. They're talking about how the levels have changed, making it less annoying to fall off edges, saying it's like invisible rails to stop you plummeting to your doom like in Mario sometimes. Good idea, but falling off platforms was a proper pain. The screenshots show it looking properly 3D, with detailed environments. It's slated for release in winter '98, both in the US and here in the UK. And they're using these collectible coins of commendation rating things, which is a bit of a mouthful. Sounds like they're pretty pleased with how it's turning out on the N64, and are hoping it keeps the true spirit of Jim. Let's hope so, eh? This page features a look at Space Circus Super Short Star, a new game coming to the N64, published by Infogrames. It's presented as a future look in N64 Magazine Jock. They've interviewed Frank Giraudon, the product manager, about the game. Apparently development is going well. They started on PC first, and the main challenge was RAM and cartridge size on the N64, but they've overcome that. They even used the PC version as a development tool, which seems sensible enough. Giraudon describes Space Circuses as a third-person game where you play as Short Star. Gameplay sounds quite varied: walking, running, jumping, swimming, using objects, and even talking to people. There's a special weapon, explosive stars that are like guided missiles, which sounds a bit different to your typical game weapon at the time. He says you can use them strategically, even around corners, which is clever. Camera control is mentioned. Apparently it's usually in a good position, but you can move it and zoom in and out quite a bit. More than in other games apparently, so no need for a map according to them. The game structure is non-linear, with 7 planets and about 21 areas in total. They are keen to stress it's not like the old SNES platformers anymore. It sounds like there's a lot of space to explore, hundreds of square miles and over 300 characters to meet, which is a lot back then. The planets will have a mix of game styles: adventure, action, platforming and combat, with a bit of an alien culture vibe to it. There are some screenshots showing Short Star in various colourful, slightly odd environments. One mentions real clouds, not misting, which is a bit of a dig at the N64's fogging issues. I suppose they are proud of no fogging. Another mentions Short Star's rummage round Space Circus's very lovely levels, and another highlights Short Star's special ability. Release is scheduled for October 98 in both the US and UK. It's described as a sterling 3D adventure, and good versus evil with a bloke that sparkles. The reviewer seems positive, saying it plays wonderfully and looks superb, with the N64 version almost as detailed as its PC cousin. They even point out there's no fogging, so you can see miles into the distance. Overall, it sounds like they are quite impressed and looking forward to its release. This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at Buck Bumble. Seems to be a new game coming out on the N64, published by Ubisoft. It's got this cyborg bumblebee chap as the main character. Looks a bit bonkers if you ask me. Apparently, you are this bee, Buck Bumble, and you're saving the world from alien mutant insectoids, which is a bit different, isn't it? Vacky. They've got an interview with the producer, Nick Clark, about the game. Seems it's been in development for ages, started as a research project back in '96, and turned into a full game in '97. They wanted to do a 3D shoot-'em-up, but with a twist, and the Bumblebee idea came about when they were messing with flight dynamics. Basing it on an insect's eye view was something new, they thought. For the look of the game, they apparently used pen and paper first, then used PCs with 3ds Max and Photoshop, taking inspiration from nature to get the scale right. They're banging on about freedom of movement in 3D, but also saying you can't get lost, so hopefully it's not just wandering around aimlessly. It's supposed to be this cartoon world from a miniature insect point of view, which could be interesting, I suppose. Multiplayer is mentioned as split screen for 2 players with different game types like races, air soccer, and gunfights. Sounds like typical multiplayer stuff really. Moku. The reviewer seems quite keen, saying it looked promising when they played an early demo. They mentioned seeing more at E3, and reckon a review copy should be with them before September. It's rated with a load of N64 coins at the bottom, 7 of them in fact, so they must be thinking it's going to be alright. There are a few screenshots dotted about showing Buck Bumble in action. Looks like he's shooting some critters and flying around some outdoor type levels. One of the screenshots says, Buck'll encounter plenty of these. Not exactly your common worm, which is a bit of an understatement looking at it. Another mentions, glorious visuals. Well, it's the N64, so let's not get ahead of ourselves, eh? But yeah, Buck Bumble, a cyborg bee shooter, coming in September apparently. Could be a laugh, could be a stinker, you never really know, do you? This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at a couple of upcoming games. First up is 12 Tales, Conquer 64, which is still shrouded in a bit of mystery it seems. Not much has been seen of it since the last E3, but apparently there's whispers it could be even better than Banjo-Kazooie, which is a bold claim. Rare are keeping quiet about the release date, saying they haven't got a publisher breathing down their necks, so it'll be out when it's ready. They've got a few screenshots showing Conker dressed up in a Stetson and another one with him in Roman soldier gear riding a unicycle. Bit odd, but looks like typical Rare quirky humour. They've also given it their collectible coins of commendation rating, which is a good sign I suppose. Garter. Then there's Tonic Trouble, which is from Ubisoft. Apparently these are early development kit screenshots, so what we're seeing is still a work in progress. The main character is called Ed, and he's got a fair few moves like crawling, leaping, gliding, hanging, climbing, and he can even use his stick as a blowpipe. Sounds like a right handful. The enemies can run away, hit you, and throw toast at you, which is a bit strange. They reckon it looked good on PC, but they're wondering if it can cut it on the N64. With the competition being so tough, we will have to wait and see, eh? It's due out in September in both the US and the UK, so not too far off. They've also given Tonic Trouble their collectible coins of commendation rating, so it must be showing some promise. This page, we've got the cover of issue 16 of Planet 64 magazine from June 1998. On the left there's the Planet 64 globe character giving it beans with an N64 controller, bless him. The big headline splash is about Psygnosis, who were a pretty big deal back then, especially for PlayStation games like Wipeout. Apparently they're going to be making games for the N64, which is a bit of a surprise, as they were seen as Sony's darlings. The article is all about how after months of rumors it's finally confirmed, Psygnosis is indeed developing for the N64. Their first game is going to be Wipeout 64, which makes sense as Wipeout was their big hit racing game. They're saying it will have new features, and even a 4-player mode, which would be quite something on the N64. There's even a quote from Howard Lincoln from Nintendo of America, sounding all chuffed about it. Down the side you've got the usual magazine blurb, list of staff, like James Ashton as the editor, Will Overton the art editor and so on, plus the address and phone number if you wanted to ring them up back in the day. Ah, simpler times. Seems like they were quite pleased with themselves to get Psygnosis on board, and fair enough, it was a bit of a coup back then. This page from N64 Magazine takes me right back, proper retro. Lost. Right up top in shortcuts, it's banging on about ISS 64 getting a price drop, and the follow-up IS 98 being pushed back to September. Something about tying in with the proper football season, which makes sense I suppose. Then there's a bit called Paul's Plant, sounds like typical N64 mag silliness, about some bloke named Paul and his plant, comparing it to Doc Cotton from EastEnders, bit random if you ask me. The main headline is all about a GoldenEye sequel being revealed at E3. Big news back then obviously. They reckon it's going to be Nintendo's big game for the show. Apparently Rare are doing it, no surprises there, they were on a roll then, weren't they? They are saying it'll be at E3 in Atlanta, which is a trek and a half, isn't it? They're teasing the title is still secret, and that it will feature familiar faces and places from the first game. Rumors are flying about some spy character called Jake Bind, which is a bit naff. Even for then, they are confident it'll be miles better than Tomorrow Never Dies on the PlayStation, which they are saying looks a bit rubbish from the early pictures. They also mention Nintendo are bringing F-Zero and Zelda, though probably not brand new versions, and Rare are showing off Banjo-Kazooie and Conker 64. Looks like we're getting 12 Tales, Conker 64 then, which is a bit of a mouthful. Third-party stuff-wise, Acclaim will be showing off Turok 2, and Infogrames have Mission Impossible. Sounds promising, I guess. There are some screenshots dotted around. Wipeout 64 looking all futuristic and speedy, then Diddy Kong Racing, Zelda 64 which we now know as Ocarina of Time, and Banjo-Kazooie looking all colourful. The captions mention Banjo-Kazooie having a proper animated intro, and Zelda 64 still being ages away from release. Typical Nintendo keeping us waiting. They joke about it being out when Shigs is good and ready, referring to Miyamoto obviously, cheeky sods. They reckon E3 is going to be a big show, and they'll be there getting knackered, walking around and bumping into Americans calling everything awesome. More news next issue apparently. All in all, typical N64 magazine really, full of exciting stuff and a bit of nonsense. This page from the magazine is looking at some of the new gear hitting the shelves, and a bit of fan-made stuff too. Right at the top, it's banging on about GoldenEye 007, as you'd expect back then, saying it properly shifted consoles, and was doing better than Tomb Raider 2 and Grand Theft Auto in the charts, which was quite something for a console exclusive. Then there's a bit about a RAM expander from Datal called the RAM Raider, promising to boost your N64 with extra memory. They reckon it's a cheap way to get 4 megabytes more. Apparently Nintendo were also planning their own 8 megabyte one for the 64DD, but it's anyone's guess when that thing would actually appear. Renter. Moving on, there's a section about fanzines, proper old school fan magazines. Pulse Interactive is mentioned. They even had a website, showing they were ahead of the curve. Their latest issue had stuff on GoldenEye, Fighter's Destiny and Gaix. N-Form is another one, from High Wycombe, reviewing older games like Elite and SNES Superscope games, plus Shadowrun and Minesweeper. Sounds like James Fry, who makes it, is taking a break to do his A-levels. Finally there's 64 Supreme, which sounds quite techy as it comes with cover discs and screenshots of games, and they were planning a disc exchange system. The new goods section is all about stuff for GoldenEye fans really. First up, a gold Nintendo 64 controller bundled with GoldenEye for £100. Then there's a game booster from Dalatel, a Game Boy adapter for your N64. For 40 quid you can play Game Boy games on your telly with cheats, but apparently, the sound is awful, which isn't ideal. Lastly, they look at the Race Leader 64 steering wheel from Guillemot. It's described as budget-friendly, with suckers to stick it to your desk. They say it feels a bit plasticky, but the pedals are decent and it's not bad if you really hate using the analog stick for racing games. Come on now, who actually does that? This page we've got a bit of retro gaming lark to start with, looking back at Nintendo's first console, the Famicom, or Family Computer as they called it. Apparently Nintendo wanted to push it as essential for the home, like a VCR, which is a laugh when you think about it now. Anyway, it sold loads in Japan. They're talking about all the dodgy clones and pirate versions that popped up, especially from the Far East. The reviewer, Jason Moore, has got his hands on one of these clone consoles, reckons it's a bit cheap and cheerful compared to the proper Nintendo machine, mentions it's got a menu built in when you switch it on, which is a bit fancy for a clone. He talks about games like Mario Bros and Zelda being important, obviously, and even mentions Penguin Wars, which was a bit of a quirky Japanese title back in the day. He's given it a retro rating of 72%, so not exactly setting the world on fire. Then over on the right, we've got an advert for Earthworm Jim 3D. Yeah, Jim's back, this time in 3D. Worming this way autumn 98 it says, so we'll see. Looks like it's coming out on the Nintendo 64, PC CD-ROM, and PlayStation. Interplay are publishing it. Hopefully it's as daft as the 2D games, but you never know with these 3D conversions, do you? Sometimes they just lose the charm. Still, Earthworm Jim, you can't help but have a bit of a soft spot for the groovy little worm, can you? This page in the mag, right? It's all about what's coming up on the N64. They've got a section called Odd, and it's previewing Pocket Monsters Stadium, or Pokemon Stadium as we'd probably call it over here. They're saying it's a bit weird, which, well, it is, in a good way I suppose, Stadium. Looking at the screenshots, it's certainly colourful and chunky, very N64 isn't it? They're on about some confusion with the 64DD, and this game originally being for that, but now it's just a standard cart. They're joking about moving to Mars, which is a bit daft. They point out a few things in the screenshots, like Gengar doing a big attack and being all demonic looking, and then a Cribbo looks like a horsey to me getting knocked out by a pointy horn. They even wonder if flying Pokemon are going to be allowed to die in the arena. Morbid bunch, aren't they? They reckon this new Pocket Monsters game is important, because the Game Boy ones, Gold and Silver, are taking their sweet time getting here, still saying sometime in 98. They think this Stadium game might tide us over, and the new shots look impressively big and brash apparently, with 3D versions of the Pocket Monsters. Then down the side, there's a list of games they're covering this month. Blimey, it's quite a list. Pocket Monsters Stadium obviously, Rat Attack, not heard of that one, Rakuga Kids that looked a bit bonkers, Space Jelly, Deathmatch South Park Cheeky, that one, Taz 3D, F-Zero X, Holy Magic Century, Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, now that's the one everyone's waiting for, Harvest Moon 64, and The Legend of the River King 64. Quite a lot to look forward to, if half of them are any good. This page has a look at Squad, with a big bold title that pretty much dominates the top half. It seems to be previewing a game called Rat Attack from Mindscape, looks like a 64 megabit cartridge, standard stuff for the time. They mention it's for 1 to 4 players, and due out in November both here and in the States. Reading on, the reviewer reckons it's about mutant rats from space invading Earth, typical bonkers game premise from back then, wasn't it? You play as these cats, the Scratch Cats, who are tooled up with weapons to fight them off. Sounds like a simple enough arcade-style blaster, set across 101 levels, all in 3D, apparently Robotron style. They're making a bit of a deal about the graphics, saying it's got skilled extrapolation, and single-roomed rathrashing. They do go on a bit about the 3D, don't they? There are screenshots dotted about, showing off the game. One bit mentions transparency on wings, talking about some little fellas on screen. Another one points out how the sprites change angle when they move. Then there's one with some cleavers, and they jokingly say someone's in for a slicing. Another screenshot shows these rats in what looks like a circus setting with a space hopper in the background. Bit random, innit? Apparently it was shown off at some media show a couple of months before, so this is probably a first look type of thing. Air V. Down the side, there are smaller screenshots showing what looks like a Pokemon type game, cause it mentions Game Boy, and transferring info to the N64. They're talking about Pokemon versions being exciting and all that. It mentions Game Boy Red and Green, those were the days, weren't they, squinting at those tiny screens? They're saying it's like seeing those Game Boy sprites blown up in glorious 3D. Bit of an exaggeration maybe, but that was the marketing blurb back then. They mention Kamekusu and Lizardon, those must be Japanese names for Pokemon, I guess Charmeleon and Charizard maybe? It's all a bit of a whirlwind of pixelated critters, isn't it? This page has got a preview of Rakuga Kids, which looks like a right colourful and bonkers fighter from Konami. A bit like Parappa the Rapper and Clay Fighter mashed together apparently. It's all graffiti themed with these wacky cartoon characters. They're saying it's kawaii, which is Japanese for cute or something, and they reckon Konami are aiming for the same sort of audience that liked Parappa. There are some screenshots showing the gameplay. It does look a bit mental with giant hamburgers and weird looking characters battling it out. Then there's a bit about Space Jelly, which is a 3D adventure that's been canned, which is a shame for those Mancunian software folks at Software Creations. Apparently bits of it might get used in other games they're working on. Next up is Deathmatch South Park for the N64. Right, South Park on the Nintendo 64, eh? They're calling it a shoot-'em-up, which is a bit of a surprise. I'd have thought platformer or something, but there you go. They mention it's got all the 2D sweary characters, which is probably going to cause a bit of a stir with Nintendo, isn't it? Coming out just before Christmas apparently, should be a laugh or a disaster, who knows. Lastly, there's Taz 3D, a 3D adventure with Taz from Looney Tunes. They are saying it's like Mario with a Looney Tunes license. Seems like everyone was chasing that Mario 64 magic back then, weren't they? Z2, who did Weetrix, are doing this one, and Infogrames are publishing. Due early 1999, so we'll see if it's any good. Could be decent for cartoon fans. This page is all about F-Zero X. Looks like they're properly excited about this one. Pedal to the metal is the headline. Bit much, isn't it? They reckon it's almost here, coming in June-ish for Japan and September for us. Published by Nintendo, naturally. 96 megs, that's a big cartridge back then. 1 to 4 players, so multiplayer fun, hopefully. Alga. They've got a load of screenshots, showing off the tracks, which look properly mental. Twisty-turny things with no barriers. Apparently crashes are aplenty. Says something about Marvel comic-style races. Bit much again, but there are supposed to be 30 vehicles and loads of courses. The reviewer's going on about the speed, 1,000 kilometers per hour plus, jaw-dropping visuals and all that. They mention Jack, Queen, King and Mystery as cups. Sounds like they're trying to make it sound epic. Reacher. Then there's a bit called Go Go! Speed Racer, where they're trying to explain how it all works. Talking about King Cup being tricky, and mentioning Red Gazelle as a character, showing off his stats and stuff. Apparently you can pick practice or normal mode. And at the bottom there's a results table with some Japanese-sounding names and times, so I guess that's what you get after a race. Overall, they're definitely pushing F-Zero X as the big thing. Let's hope it lives up to the hype. This page is having a look at the new River King game for the N64, Legend of the River King 64. Seems like Victor Interactive are remaking their old Game Boy fishing game into a proper 3D affair. They're banging on about realistic fish and using fogging effects to make it look murky underwater, which was a thing back then on the N64. Apparently there are loads of fish to catch and it's got some RPG elements to it, not just straight fishing. One of the captions is having a bit of a laugh about eating the fish. No wonder he's looking sad. We're having him for dinner. Which is a bit dark, innit? Then there's a bit called An Ear to the Ground, chatting about other games. Daikatana is finally confirmed for the N64. They've been talking about that for ages. It's using the Quake engine, so they reckon it should be decent enough, though we'll see. THQ are bringing over Road Rash and Nuclear Strike, which could be alright, and Atari are doing a version of Gauntlet for the N64. A proper old-school hack and slash. That could be a laugh with 4 players, like the arcade days. They're also saying Turok 2 multiplayer is supposed to be good, even comparable to GoldenEye, which is high praise indeed. More on Turok 2 next issue apparently. Sakana. There are some snaps of the team making the River King game, looking at Tokyo SeaWorld for research, and another one from the Tokyo Game Show with loads of Pikachu stuff in the background. Intriguing indeed, they say, which it sort of is, in a weird 90s Japanese game show way. That's about it really, bit of a fishing game preview and a quick roundup of other bits and bobs coming out. This page is about Holy Magic Century, or Quest 64 as those Yanks might know it, or even L-Tail if you're in Japan. They can't make their mind up, can they? Anyway, it's showing off its true colors apparently, and the reviewer is saying, now that's magic. There are a few screenshots dotted around. One with a giant demonic crow attacking, which looks a bit dramatic. Another one shows a bloke in a pub, who looks like he's about to give you some profound wisdom, but the caption suggests it's probably just drunken nonsense. The review mentions that finally, after what felt like ages of waiting, we're getting to see the English version. They go on about the battle system being less confusing now, with glowing barriers making more sense as combat arenas. Apparently you collect crystals to boost your elemental magic earth, water, fire and air. Bit standard RPG fare really, but hey, it's N64 so gotta take what you can get. They reckon there are loads of places to explore, and a day-to-night cycle, which they seem to think is a big deal. Sounds like they're cautiously optimistic, saying they'll take a proper look when it's closer to release. Overall, seems like they're trying to build up some hype for this RPG, even though it sounds a bit like your typical medieval fantasy game. Hopefully it's alright when it actually comes out. This page in N64 Magazine from June '98 seems to be diving into some potential trouble in paradise with Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Apparently, it was supposed to be out for Christmas '97, but got pushed back to April, and now they're saying it might be even later, towards the end of the year. They're wondering if it's due to combat being too complex, or some falling out between Miyamoto and Yamauchi over using a 64DD disc or a cartridge. All very hush-hush. There's a screenshot of Link seemingly getting zapped by electric jellyfish inside some monster, which looks a bit grim. Another picture shows Link carving "I was ear" into a tree. Cheeky sod. They reckon the delays are down to polishing and adding movie elements, and it's gonna be a long wait. Then there's a bit about Harvest Moon 64. Sounds like it's a farming sim RPG coming to the N64. They're joking that you might run screaming from the room, but then suggest relaxing and taking it all in. It's mentioned there aren't many dungeons or monsters, focusing more on crops and cows, and even getting a girlfriend and married charming. It's packing soft and due in Japan in the summer, with a UK release date TBA. Lastly, there's Ask FUSO YA. Someone's written in asking about RPG recommendations, listing Luna 2, Final Fantasy 2i, Chrono Trigger, Landstalker, and Zelda 2i as their favorites. Fusoya, whoever he is, lists his top 10, which includes Final Fantasy V 2i, Zelda IV, Link's Awakening, Final Fantasy II, Seiken Densetsu 3, Chrono Trigger, Earthbound, Terranigma, Zelda 2i, Luna, Eternal Blue, and Final Fantasy V 2. A solid list of games there, even if some of them are Japanese imports. There's also a question about import stores for RPG translations, and Fusoya mentions Game Cave in the States, and suggests using the internet. Fancy that! He also answers a question about a sequel to the SNES game's 7th saga, saying it was Mystic Arc but sadly, it never left Japan. Sounds about right. Typical. This page is all about the N64 Magazine Reader Awards from 1998. It's boasting about being bigger than the Brits and Oscars, which is a bit much, isn't it? Apparently they spent ages deciding on the top 10 N64 games, as voted for by the readers. They reckon GoldenEye came out on top, which, yeah, fair enough, it was brilliant back then. They even put it controversially above Mario 64, which might have ruffled some feathers. They also mention Mario Kart 64 and Pilotwings 64 as being high up there. Pilotwings, bless it, they call it unfashionable, which is a bit harsh, but I suppose it wasn't exactly the cool kid on the block compared to Mario and James Bond. There's a picture of the magazine cover, issue 13, and it's their first birthday awards issue. Mario is on the cover holding a paintbrush, and it mentions GoldenEye again for a Spymaster competition. It also mentions a free book, a double game guide. Ah, those were the days, getting freebies with your magazine. They're suggesting if you missed issue 13, you should order a back issue. Clever marketing, that. This page from N64 Magazine takes me right back, doesn't it? It's all about the reader's top games, a proper rundown from 20 to number 1. Starting at the bottom end, positions 20 to 11, we've got games like Nagano Winter Olympics, WCW vs NWO, Extreme G, Shadows of the Empire, Fighter's Destiny, Top Gear Rally, Duke Nukem, Snowboard Kids, Blast Corps, and right at number 11, Yoshi's Story. Solid games, some a bit meh, others proper classics. Then we get to the top 10, the real meat and potatoes. Pilotwings 64 is at number 10, they reckon it's underrated, which, fair enough, it was a bit of a looker. Turok. Dinosaur Hunter is at number 9, described as a fabulous shoot-'em-up, and second only to GoldenEye, which is quite a claim back then. FIFA 98 is at 8, Wave Race 64 at 7, ISS 64 at 6, Lilat Wars at 5, Mario Kart 64 at number 4, hold on a minute, Mario Kart only 4th. They're having a right moan about that, saying it shouldn't be below Diddy Kong Racing. Sounds like someone in the office is a bit miffed. Proper overreaction. Diddy Kong Racing is at number 3, Super Mario 64 at number 2, and predictably, GoldenEye 007 takes the top spot with a massive vote count, nearly 4,000 votes. No surprises there. Everyone was obsessed with GoldenEye back then. Death matches with your mates, hours wasted, brilliant. They're going on about it being immersive and eye-numbingly brilliant. Bit much maybe, but yeah, it was good. Dester. There's also a bit where they list their own top 20 games. Bit cheeky comparing it to the readers' votes, and some details about competition winners who won games and bits of kit. All in all, pretty standard stuff for an N64 mag back then. Everyone wanted to know what the top games were. GoldenEye at number 1, of course, who'd have thought it. This page kicks off with a bit of a head-scratcher about Japanese dating games. Under the title, Unima, the bloke writing reckons they're a bit odd, trying to simulate real life but in a really detached way, almost intentionally missing the point. He mentions these girlfriend simulator arcade machines, sounding like proper weird contraptions with all sorts of strange knobs. Can't quite picture them myself, but sounds a bit much for 100 yen a go. There's a picture of one of these dating games, called Magikaru Date, looks like your typical anime girls on the screen. He makes a joke about it not being a healthy pastime for young lads, which is probably a fair point. Then there's a section about Konami winning the World Cup. Well, in Japan at least. Seems there's a bit of a kerfuffle, because Konami's JICU World Soccer 98 is still doing really well over there, even though the European and American versions of IS 98 weren't up to much apparently. Bit of confusion over the FIFA license too, with EA supposedly having it for their football games, but Konami seem to have got in on the act somehow, with JICU World Soccer 3. There are some screenshots of the game, looks like typical football fare from back then, slightly blocky but playable enough. The article points out that Japanese N64 owners won't get to hear Tony Guba doing the commentary like we would here. Instead they're stuck with Tom G, who was in last year's JICU game. They're promising a review of JICU World Soccer, the World Cup in France 98 when it comes out, and reckon it's about time for something a bit less niche than the other games they've been playing, like NFL Quarterback Club 98 and 64 Osumo. Finally, there's a little box called Made in Japan with a picture of Max Everingham, apparently when he's not peering up poor girls' skirts. Bit cheeky that he's off in Japan digging up all the Nintendo gossip for the magazine. Sounds like a hard life. This page in the mag is having a bit of a laugh about some quirky Japanese games. First up, there's a snippet about Mr. Miyamoto dodging questions about a Star Fox sequel, playing coy as usual, saying maybe if he gets some new ideas. Then there's a piece on Legend of River King 64 Feet, and Moon 64. Seems they're bringing out a fishing game, called Nushizuri in Japan, which translates to Legend of River King, for the N64. They're banging on about how realistic it is, and how it's a heartwarming experience, which sounds a bit much for a fishing game, doesn't it? Apparently it's a 64-bit version of Harvest Moon GB, which is described as a gardening RPG hit, but now with fishing, and even milking cows. Righto. Next there's some info on F-Zero X coming out in June. They're talking about the races having animal-themed names and machines, and not being able to tweak the speed or acceleration, but there being loads of them with different abilities. They even list a few races: Captain Falcon, Pico, Jodie Summer, Dr. Stewart, Samurai Goro, and Gazelle, giving a quick description of their machines like Blue Falcon being balanced, Wild Goose for acceleration, White Cat for speed, Golden Fox for light and fast, Fire Stingray for heavy and balanced, and Red Gazelle as extremely light. Looks fast and colourful from the screenshots, typical F-Zero then. There's also a bit about new types of controllers for simulation games, mentioning fishing game controllers, and train driving ones. And they're making a joke about a photo-taking machine in games that encourages you to take snaps of girls' skirts. Bit dodgy that, isn't it? Finally, there's a Learn Japanese section, which is a regular thing in these mags. This time it's teaching you phrases to pick up Japanese birds, like asking for their name, saying your mates fancy them, asking if they want to go fishing, or even, "Hi sweet thing, what you doing when the sun goes down?" Cheeky. This page in the magazine is all about the GoldenEye Spy Master competition, right? It seems like they set a challenge in issue 13, asking people to get a 90% plus headshot rate in GoldenEye 007. They thought it would be a proper toughie, but blimey, people cheated. Apparently everyone just used one bullet per soldier's head and finished the level that way. Bit cheeky if you ask me. Dayed. Anyway, a lad called Patrick Wessels from Holland clocked in a time of 31 seconds on the bunker level, which is pretty rapid. They mention another bloke, Steven Zwartjes, and someone else from Norway, Per Lungarten, doing similar times but slightly slower. Apparently these Europeans are the ones to watch when it comes to GoldenEye. There's a Nottingham lad, Chris Parkinson, who got 32 seconds, so not quite good enough. Poor bloke. Sapayuk. They're showing off Patrick's winning mission, saying he just moved like the wind and got a bit lucky. There are some screenshots showing the game, you know, the blocky textures we all remember, and a picture of a golden gun trophy on a wooden plinth, with a plaque saying, "The greatest GoldenEye player in Europe." Bit flash in it? Bolds. It looks like Patrick gets the golden gun trophy and a gold license to kill, while Steven gets a silver license to kill, and Per gets a bronze version. So fair play to Patrick Wessels, he's officially the top GoldenEye player in Europe, according to Planet 64 anyway. Good on ya, lad. This page from N64 Arena, yeah, issue 16, it says at the bottom, blimey, takes you back. It's all about World Cup 98, the football game. Remember that one? They were asking if it could compete with IS-98, which was always a bit of a favourite for the proper footy fans, wasn't it? They've got their scoring guide down the side, all colour-coded with little balls, very N64 Mag style. Yellow is 85%, and above star game they called it, only for the proper top draw stuff. Then blue for 84% to 70%, still good games apparently, jolly good fun. Green is 69% to 50%, they reckon these are alright, perfectly playable, but nothing special. Red 49% to 20%, lazily programmed, or hurriedly cobbled together, ouch. And then grey, 19% to 0%, disaster zone, haha, not pulling any punches are they? Always good to know where you stand, wasn't it, with these mags? There's a little screenshot of World Cup 98 in action, looks a bit blocky now mind, but back then it was probably the bee's knees. Ah, simpler times, eh? This page from N64 Magazine must be from around June 98, judging by the little corner there. It's got a mixed bag of games on show. Right at the top we've got Aero Fighters Assault, which was a decent enough arcade shooter on the system, not mind-blowing but fun, and Forsaken, that was one of those tunnel shooters, a bit dizzying at times but looked quite snazzy. Then there's Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey 98, because who didn't love a bit of ice hockey back then, eh? Below that Rampage World Tour, bringing back the Monster Mash from the arcades, good for a laugh with your mates. Moving over to the right, Import Arena highlighting games from America and Japan, with Air Border 64, another one of those extreme sports games. There were loads of them at the time trying to be the next big thing. And rounding it off for the game's titles is Jeopardy! Kurinor. Because who doesn't want to pretend they are on a quiz show? Kurinor. Down at the bottom they've got a How It Works section explaining their review scores, breaking it down into visuals, sounds, how well you get to grips with it, which they call mastery, lifespan, and then the overall verdict. Bit scientific for a game review, isn't it? Then you have Team 64, their panel of experts, each with a little quote, and their game of the month. James Ashton loves his football, reckons World Cup 98 is the game. Will Overton, bit of an old-timer, also on the football vibe with World Cup 98. Paul Jarrold, not keen on football clearly, going for Jeopardy as his top pick. Andrea Bull thinks the football transfer deadlines are slacking, says something about Rampage, a bit random. Tim Weaver is on about tea and swearing and likes Gex 64, that gecko was everywhere for a bit. Martin Kitts, bit of a hard man by the sound of it, prefers Forsaken. Jess Bickham, Barbie girl in a Barbie world, chooses Buck Bumble, which was a bit of a weird game about a bee. And James Price likes Earthworm Jim, another odd one, but it had its fans. So there you go, that's what Team 64 are playing and thinking. This page then, issue 16 of N64 Mag, seems to be focusing on world games, more specifically football it looks like. They're obviously still on about World Cup 98 after featuring it last issue, seems like they are milking that cow a bit dry, eh? There's a few screenshots dotted about, showing off the in-game action. You've got the usual blocky looking polygons from back then, but it's trying to be all realistic with stadiums and weather and all that jazz. One bit mentions Jurgen Kohler pulling some kind of shambler from Quake pose, which is a bit of a weird comparison, but I suppose they're trying to be funny. Another bit of text talks about skipping the team walkout bit, which fair enough. Who actually wants to watch that every time? And they're banging on about accurate stadiums and customizable weather, which was probably a big deal back then, I suppose. Oh, and apparently the reviewer is rubbish at penalties, saying they tried and failed to miss on purpose. Sounds like my kind of player. This page is all about World Cup 98 for the N64, right in time for the tournament in France. It's an EA Sports job, so you know it's going to look the part, and they are banging on about the slickest presentation, which is standard for them. There's screenshots of the game in action, showing off some goals and player celebrations. Apparently the commentator is pretty accurate, predicting England's first World Cup match, which is a bit of fun. They also highlight a nasty touchline tussle, which sounds like typical football game excitement at the time. They mention the game options like friendly matches, World Cup, penalty shootout and training, plus you can play classic World Cup finals if you win the cup itself, so that's a bit of replay value. They're going on about compression technology, which is supposed to make the controls more responsive, claiming it's quicker than FIFA 64. The price tag is £60, which was a fair whack back then, and they're wondering if it's worth it, especially with IS-98 coming out in September. Good question actually, might have been worth waiting for ISS to be fair. They reckon it's still well worth waiting for, so they are clearly trying to sell it, aren't they? Brazil are favourites to win, apparently, but you could have a home country victory, that's the dream, in it. This page in N64 Magazine takes a look at World Cup 98 for the N64, back when we were all excited for France 98. It's got a feature called First 11. Bit of wordplay there, clever. Yusu. First off, it talks about real teams, real players. Apparently this game is a step up, because it's got actual international squads and player names. They list a bunch of England players like Seaman, Adams, Campbell, Southgate, Beckham and Shearer, the usual suspects. They reckon the players look a bit like their real-life counterparts, even if some of them are a bit sunbedded or have dodgy blonde hair, bit harsh on Shearer maybe. Then it goes into the real World Cup bit. They're saying this game's World Cup mode is more like the actual tournament than ISS64, which apparently had some dodgy 36-team league that was a bit of a nightmare. World Cup 98 has the right teams and stadia, which is good I suppose if you're into that kind of thing. Control is the next bit. They reckon the controls are nice and responsive, unlike FIFA 64, which they imply was a bit clunky, but they also moan about unrealistic dribbling and say sending players off is a bit too easy. Milk round sendings off, they call it. Sounds about right for footy games back then, always something a bit off. Finally, Helping Hands is about the computer AI helping you out. They mention that the computer controls player movements and tackles. It's a bit semi-automatic for player selection, and they say you never quite know if the computer is going to tackle for you. They turn that feature off in the N64 office apparently, calling it a pain. Probably right, sounds a bit annoying if you like to be in control. There are a few screenshots dotted around showing the game in action, menus and some player lineups. All in all, it seems like they're cautiously optimistic about World Cup 98, but in a typical British Games mag kind of way, not getting too carried away. The next page in this N64 mag takes a look at World Cup 98 for the console. It starts off with game speed, which apparently is a new feature. They reckon speeding things up from the default can help with the lag, which I remember being a bit of a pain back then. The reviewer says it can make it a bit too fast-paced though. Next up is the dressing room, which is all about tactics. Finally, they've got the tactical side of things right in a footy game apparently. You can mess around with player placement, marking, and all that jazz. They mention the world class's difficulty and say it's properly challenging, a bit like ISS64 from last year. Then there's handicapping, which is a bit of a controversial one. There's this catch-up logic thing that helps the team that's losing, bit like basketball apparently, to keep things close. And there's also proper team handicapping based on team skill, so if you fancy playing as Japan against Brazil for a laugh, you can tweak things to make it fairer. Boys. New moves are featured next. Of course you need new moves. Apparently World Cup 98 has got a few, including a deliberate foul and some goalkeeper moves, like Schmeichel punching the ball out and dribbling. They reckon these are a bit tricky to pull off with the controls. Lastly, there's camera angles. You can basically stick the camera wherever you want in this game, which is a nice touch. They suggest sticking with the default end-in view, but you can mess about with it to get your Andy Gray post-goal analysis on the go. Oh, and tucked away there's a little bit about the advertising hoardings in the game being the same slogans in the same places, and there's also Trivial Pursuit, where you get a World Cup trivia question after each half, proper hard ones apparently. This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at World Cup 98 for the N64. Right at the top there's a bit about player aggression in the game, apparently hidden in the options somewhere. They call it a sliding scale, and you can go from calm like Gary Lineker to nutter like Vinnie Jones, which sounds about right. It basically changes how aggressive the tackles are in the game. Then there's a bit about classic team mode, which sounds quite good actually. It lets you play classic World Cup finals from the past, like Uruguay against Argentina, England's '66 win, and Italy beating West Germany in '82. There's a screenshot of the England versus West Germany match, showing some of the old player names. Looks like Banks, Wilson, Cohen, Styles for England, and for West Germany it's guys like Tilkowski, Schultz, Weber, Holler, proper old school legends. It says it's a good way to relive those moments, although maybe a bit limited. Coent. Next up is the commentary. Apparently they've got John Motson and Des Lynam doing the commentary, which is decent for the time. They reckon it's a big improvement over whatever donkey they had doing the commentary in ISS64, which is a fair point to be honest. ISS64's commentary was a bit ropey. The main part of the page is about the game itself. It says every year we'd get a new FIFA game, and magazines would always point out it wasn't as good as the other footy games, but it would still sell loads. This World Cup game, they reckon it's similar to FIFA, plays the same, looks the same. It's got all the official stuff though, player names, cup setups, the whole shebang. They admit it's still not as good as ISS64, which most of us knew was the better game back then. But they say if you want to play a proper World Cup game on the N64, this is the only one. Apparently, The International Cup in ISS-64 was a bit of a mess because of some legal stuff. They do say the camera is a bit sticky in World Cup 98, not jerky but sticky, whatever that means. But on the plus side, you can mess about with the teams, and put in your own team if you want. Which is a laugh, like if you wanted to get rid of England and put in Bulgaria or something, huh? So yeah, World Cup 98 looks alright if you really wanted a World Cup game on the N64, but ISS-64 was still the king. This page is a review of World Cup 98 on the N64, back when we were all buzzing about the console. Looking at the screenshots, they've got some of those classic little captions poking fun at the game, like, insert your own joke here, over a pile-up of players, and another one joking about the ball shrinking, typical magazine humor from back then. The review itself is broken down into visuals, sounds, mastery, and lifespan, giving it a 6 for visuals, saying the players are just not quite right. Sounds got an 8, which is decent, mentioning tub thumping, that Chumbawamba song that was everywhere. Motown tunes, crowd noise, but some iffy music too. Mastery and lifespan both get a 6, with mastery saying it's not streets ahead of the PlayStation version, and lifespan being a bit low because, well, it's just the World Cup. The final verdict is 73%, which is alright, okay as they put it. They reckon you could learn to like it, especially with the World Cup license being a draw. But the reviewer hints that there are better footy games out there, which at the time you knew they were probably thinking of ISS, or International Superstar Soccer as it was called. They even mention FIFA 64 earlier in the text, saying this World Cup game isn't as good, which is a bit of a dig as FIFA 64 wasn't exactly amazing on the N64 either. They go on a bit about control delays and player reactions not being great, saying it's a problem in computer games in general, which was something you definitely noticed back then compared to today's games. Price-wise, it was 60 quid, which was a lot of pocket money back then. They compare it to ISS 64, which was cheaper, and reckon that was better value. It's a fair, if slightly underwhelming review for World Cup 98, sums up how a lot of us probably felt about it at the time. Not terrible, but not amazing either. This page is a review of Aero Fighter's Assault on the N64, scored a rather lukewarm 58%. It's from issue 16, back in 98. Aero Fighter's Assault, remember that one? It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't amazing either, and the review here kind of sums it up. Visually, apparently, there's a lot of border around the screen. Sounds are a bit of a mess with incessant chatter and abysmal music. Mastery is apparently better suited to the Saturn, and the lifespan is short, most missions done in under 2 minutes apparently. The verdict is pretty damning, saying it's not a bad game, but there are at least 30 others you should consider before it. Ouch. Martin Kitts, the reviewer, suggests if you want a flight sim, get Pilot Wings 64, and for a shoot-em-up, Lilac Wars is the better bet. He reckons if you've got 50 quid burning a hole in your pocket and fancy a weekend distraction, then maybe Aero Fighter's Assault is for you. Not exactly a ringing endorsement then. There are screenshots dotted around showing the gameplay, you know, jets flying around, explosions, that sort of thing. Looks fairly typical N64 era graphics. There's a bit about a secret plane too, a F-15, which you can unlock by pressing a Konami code-like sequence on the title screen, which might add a bit of replay value, I suppose. They also mention they reviewed the Japanese version of Aero Fighter's Assault in issue 11 previously. Right at the top there's a little bit about journalists going to lengths to get pictures of England's World Cup training camp, very topical for the time in 98. And a joke about a submarine crew preferring FIFA to ISS 64, classic 90s console wars banter. Overall it's a pretty average review for a pretty average game from back in the day. This page is all about Forsaken on the N64, remember that one? Seems like N64 Magazine were pretty chuffed with it, giving it a Star Game Award. Looking back, it was a decent enough shooter, wasn't it? Proper futuristic stuff with those crafts zipping around. They've got some screenshots here showing off the explosions and the dark corridors you'd be flying through. One text box mentions Metatank's funeral pyre. Bit dramatic, weren't they? Another one talks about things burning like they're doused in rocket fuel. Bit over the top, lads. Apparently the transpulse thing is handy for lighting up dark bits, makes sense. And they point out your craft can be a bit slow underwater, and you need to watch out for lasers. There's a bit about blowing up enemies near doors as a sub-game. Sounds a bit daft, but hey, it's the 90s. They're also impressed with the lighting effects in the explosions. Fair enough, they were quite something for the time, weren't they? Down in the corner, there's a little box with the game details. Forsaken from Acclaim apparently. It was supposed to be out in the first week in June, and cost £60, blimey. Games were pricey back then. Needed a controller pack and rumble pack of course. And they've given it a score of 96M, and a rating of 14, whatever that means exactly. Good score though, seems like they liked it, for a bit at least. The next page in the mag is all about Forsaken, that new shooter on the N64. Proper sci-fi setting this one. It's got a feature called Bring on the Freaks, showcasing the playable characters you can choose from. They've got Beard, this hairy geezer who used to be a roadie and got into fashion, then ended up lugging his dead mate around on a hoverbike because he wouldn't shave bit grim. Then there's LAJ, a ladies adore type solar surfer. Bit of a petty criminal apparently. Clark Culver is the brainy one, a 9-year-old prodigy who built his hoverbike out of recycled bits and bobs. Bit of a whiz kid then. Nim Soo Sun is the babe with blades, thrown out of hairdressing school and found solace in vodka and goblins. Sounds like a wild one. Rex the trucker used to haul paper and then found religion and guns. Bit of a space preacher type. And Loka Senna, she's a female racer who rebuilt herself after a soapbox derby crash and wants revenge. Sounds like she means business. Lastly, there's Earl Sleek, a smooth-talking DJ who's after the ladies. Seems a bit of a lad. And finally, Footoid, which is a bit of a nasty name, who was once a swimmer but got turned into some mutated thing by pollution. Bit of a freak show, that one. It's all setting up the story for Forsaken, about saving the world from robots and choosing your least repellent warrior. Bit of a tongue-in-cheek way of putting it. They all look a bit mad in their own way, typical 90s sci-fi character roster. Looks like a decent lineup for a bit of futuristic blasting. This page then is all about the weaponry you'll be using in Forsaken. It's headlined, "A whole lot of shooting going on," which is pretty much what you'd expect from an N64 shooter, in it. They're saying no shoot 'em up is complete without a shed load of weapons, which is fair enough. They've broken it down into guns and missiles, and are showing off a bunch of them with little screenshots. For the guns you've got your standard pulsar. Sounds a bit generic if you ask me, but they reckon it's a good all-rounder. Then there's the sus gun, which they're taking the mickey out of a bit, saying it's useless, which is a bit harsh if you ask me, but funny. The beam laser looks like your typical pew-pew laser beam, handy for taking out those pesky gun placements from a distance. Then you've got the Trojax, a slow-firing but powerful number, and the Transpulse, which bounces off walls. Sounds a bit fiddly but could be useful for corners, I suppose. And lastly, in the gun section there's the Mug, which is a missile gun. Bit of a weird name, but apparently you start each level with 5 of these bad boys. Moving on to missiles, first up is the MFRL. Sounds like a printer brand, but it's a multiple fire rocket launcher, good for clearing out groups of enemies, they say. Then there's the Solaris, a homing missile which sounds pretty standard for these games, and the Scatter, which is a bit of a pain in the backside apparently, because if you use it against standard enemies and you get hit, it scatters all your power-ups. Cheers for that. Then there's the Titan missile, proper king of missiles apparently, explodes all over the shop, good for bosses. The Gravgon is a weird one, freezes enemies in a blue force field, a bit of an oddity they reckon. And lastly, there's Mines Purge, Quantum and Pine 3 types, all pretty useless apparently, except for maybe defending a target. So yeah, a good old look at the arsenal in Forsaken. Seems like they've got you covered for blasting aliens back to wherever they came from. Looks alright, this Forsaken game. Might be worth a rent when it comes out. This page in N64 Magazine features a guide on how to become a 360 degrees tactical genius in Forsaken. It's all about using the game's environment to your advantage, strafing around corners and using vertical controls to confuse enemies in those mad tunnels. The article talks about dipping below or above tunnels to lose enemies, and then popping back up to blast them with your pulsars. There's a few screenshots showing the gameplay, typical late 90s 3D graphics, quite blocky but it was pretty impressive at the time. The hoverbikes looked alright, didn't they? Gay. Then there's a bit called Fun Boy 4, which is about Forsaken's multiplayer. They reckon it's a decent idea to have up to 4 players, with up to 3 being CPU controlled, which was quite generous for back then, especially as they mentioned Snowboard Kids and GoldenEye as other examples of good multiplayer. But it sounds like the reviewer thinks it's a bit of a letdown. They moan about it being hard to tell who you're chasing, and that the weapons don't do much damage, making rounds drag on. Bit harsh maybe, but yeah, Forsaken's multiplayer probably wasn't going to set the world on fire compared to the single player, which was alright for a blast. There are more screenshots showing the multiplayer in action, with the different player windows. They even mention player 1 getting twice the screen size, which seems a bit unfair, doesn't it? Still, classic N64 mag page, bit of game advice, and a quick review of the multiplayer mode. This page in N64 Magazine features a look at the game Forsaken for the N64. It's a bit of a Descent or Quake-like, they say, which was quite the thing back then with these newfangled 3D first-person shooters. The reviewer reckons Forsaken is a bit of an old-school shooter mixed with some puzzle elements, comparing it to Turok 2 and the likes of Axelay or R-Type for some reason. Bit of a stretch to compare it to a side-scrolling shooter if you ask me. They mention the single-player experience being a bit confusing at first, but once you get your head around it, it's alright. Apparently you're navigating these maze-like tunnels in a flying craft, blasting away at boxy enemies. They highlight the different branching paths you can take, easy or hard routes, a bit like Star Fox they say, and the graphics are supposedly outstanding for the time, though looking at these screenshots now, they're a bit blocky, aren't they? There are little captions next to the screenshots, one saying, "Pretty, but dangerous" about some enemies, and another about an underwater chamber, where the evil spawn carrier lives, telling you not to go too far inside. Another one mentions not painting your room blue, saying it's bad karma, a bit random that. Then there's one about a metal lump, and pulsars. And finally one showing a docking bay, and a small craft called Dreadnought. Overall it seems like they think Forsaken is a decent enough shooter, if a bit challenging, and definitely focused on action and blowing things up, rather than a deep story. Good for a bit of adrenaline, they say, if you're into that sort of thing. This page from the magazine is having a look at Forsaken on the N64. It looks like a decent space shooter, very much in the style of Descent if you remember that on the PC, where you are flying around tunnels shooting robots. The graphics are mentioned as being really smooth and silky, which back then was high praise for an N64 game. They reckon the explosions and lighting effects are top-notch too, giving it a lava lamp effect. Bit of a weird comparison, but I get what they mean. The reviewer mentions how it's good in 4-player mode as well, with no fogging, which was always a bonus on the N64, as some games did suffer a bit from draw distance. They're comparing it to GoldenEye and Mario 64, but saying Forsaken gives a better sense of solid enemies, even though they aren't motion captured, which is an interesting point. They also mention the control system being a bit cumbersome, even compared to Turok, which wasn't exactly known for its simple controls. The review talks about how the game is challenging, mentioning struggling with a boss called Nutter, and how they had many attempts to beat it. They suggest trying to finish the first level quickly to unlock more routes in the game, which sounds like a good bit of replayability. Overall, they seem to quite like it, giving it a very respectable 87% verdict, calling it a spectacular, nerve-jangling experience. Sounds like it was a solid game for its time, and certainly something different from the usual platformers and shooters on the N64. This page in N64 Magazine, issue 16 it is, takes us back to 1998 then, eh? Right then, front and center we have Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey 98. Oh, what a mugging, the title screams, which isn't exactly selling it, is it? So, flicking through, it seems like the review is a bit of a downer really. They're going on about how this new Gretzky game, 98 edition, isn't much cop compared to the first one. Apparently they've slapped a new roster on it, tweaked a few bits and bobs, but it's basically the same game. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, they reckon Midway are thinking. But maybe it was a bit broke in the first place? They're saying the original wasn't perfect, and could have done with some proper new stuff, not just a roster update and a polish. They mention previous Gretzky games on the N64 were alright. Good arcade fun and all that, but this one just feels a bit lazy. Visually they call it chunky and unspectacular. Sounds are a 3 out of 10. Mastery a 4, lifespan a 7, and the final verdict is a 70%. Not exactly flying off the shelves with praise, is it? Looks like they're suggesting you can now pick up the first game cheaper, which is a backhanded compliment if I ever heard one. There are some screenshots of the game, looks like standard hockey fare, bit of rough and tumble, which they highlight with captions like blatant thuggery and rollerball fatality. There's a little box giving you the button combo to get the players fighting, mind you, in case you wanted to get your knuckles bloody, and another one for big heads. Because, you know, that's what we were all after back then, massive heads. Overall it sounds like they are saying it's not terrible, just a bit pointless. A bit of a cash-in maybe. Still, it's Gretzky's, you know. So it probably still sold a few copies. Even if it was a bit of a mugging. Ah well, that's 98 for you, wasn't always a winner, was it? This page is a review of Rampage World Tour for the N64 from Midway. It's got a big green title across the middle, and some screenshots of the game above and below it. The reviewer is writing about how back in the day, games like Marble Madness, Gauntlet, Paperboy and Road Blasters were the stuff of legend in arcades. Real playground talk. Rampage was another one of those, proper city-destroying stuff with monsters, for up to 3 players. Apparently, it was the most violent game ever, which sounds about right for the time. Ampeus. They talk about how they thought this N64 version would be a full 64-bit update, but it looks a bit like the old Commodore 64 version, graphics-wise. The reviewer reckons the graphics are a bit dated, but that's part of the charm maybe. They mention you can still play with 4 players, and that the characters and gameplay are just like they were back in '85 when WOM were top of the pops, which is a bit of a dated reference, even for '98. There's a box giving it scores out of 100 in different areas. Visuals and sounds both get a mediocre 2 out of 10, saying the animation is poor and the sounds are just terrible guitar samples. Mastery gets a 1, saying it's just like those old 80s arcade emulators. Lifespan gets a 5, which is not bad, and the multiplayer mode gets a mention as chaotic fun. Overall, the verdict is verdict in big letters, and they say you'll get sick of it before you finish it, and it looks like an Amiga game, but hey, it's still Rampage. They give it a score of 54%, which is pretty average really. It seems like a bit of a nostalgia trip, but maybe not a great game on its own merits for the price of £40. Could probably get loads of Spetsy tapes for that money, maybe even one with the original Rampage on it. This page in N64 Magazine, bless it, is all about import games, so you knew you were in for something a bit different. They're taking a look at Airborder 64, and right away the headline is pretty telling. The natural successor to 1080 Degrees then? No. Slightly sarcastic even back then, weren't they? Warrington? Judging by the screenshots, it's clearly trying to be a snowboarding game but on tarmac, or something. You've got your fella on a board, zipping along, doing tricks it seems. One picture even mentions lens flare, classic N64 era graphics trick. Another one's got them in what looks like a giant's house, going through a mouse hole. A bit bonkers then. The review itself isn't exactly raving about it. They bring up Human, the developers, and their previous F1 game, which wasn't apparently up to much. They kind of hint that Airborder 64 inches isn't exactly setting the world alight either, saying it's a bit boring even if it looks alright technically. They compare it to 1080-degree snowboarding because, well, boards are involved, but it sounds like it misses the mark. They mention a time trial mode with checkpoints like in Pilot Wings, which sounds a bit odd for a boarding game, doesn't it? Tracks are apparently well designed but too easy, which isn't ideal. So overall, seems like they were a bit underwhelmed by Airborder 64. Not quite the 1080 degrees killer we might have hoped for back then. Ah well, plenty more fish in the sea, or carts in the shop, at the time. The next page in the magazine takes a look at Airborder 64, remember that one? They're running through 5 of the levels you can cruise around in, calling them arenas. First up is Green Park, which is your typical skate park kind of thing. Then there is Lost Forest, which sounds a bit bonkers, like Turok but with a dead dragon in it apparently. Then there's Snow Festival 64, set in a city. They say it's like San Francisco Rush but on a board. Sunset Island is like Wave Race, naturally. And then Giant House, which is like something out of Honey I Shrunk the Kids, all massive furniture and bits and bobs. Then the Norsa has. They've got a little bit about what airboarding is all about, basically snowboarding without the frostbite, and you hover about a bit. Accessibility is simple they reckon, the visuals are good, sounds are a bit like a keyboard piano, and mastery and lifespan are middling. Overall, they've given it a rather average score of 58%, saying it's a bit quirky but doesn't really have much to keep you going, or much variety. Oh, and they mention a no slide trick that only gets you 100 points. Hardly worth it. Down the side there's a little info box saying it's out in Japan, not likely here in the UK, needs a controller pack and rumble pack, and cost about 38 quid, which was a fair bit back then. This page has a right kicking from N64 Magazine, and it's all aimed squarely at the Jeopardy game on the N64. Apparently it's so bad it's even worse than Wheel of Fortune, which they didn't rate that highly to begin with. N64. Visually they reckon it's like going back to the Stone Age of graphics on the N64, which is a bit harsh but you get the picture. Sound-wise, it's just the Jeopardy theme tune and some clip speech from Alex Trebek, the host, which they say gets old real quick. Warrington. Morrington. Mastery-wise? Forget about it, apparently, even your old ZX Spectrum could do better. Ouch. And lifespan? They're saying you'll probably switch it off after one go because it's that tedious. The review also mentions that the questions are very American-focused, so if you're not clued up on US stuff you're going to struggle. There's a funny bit about one of the player characters looking a bit like Tony Blair, and another bit about Alex Trebek not really looking interested. The reviewer, Paul O'Donovan, basically says it's a waste of money, giving it a measly 9% verdict score. He sums it up as a sorry excuse for a computer game. Looks like this one was a proper stinker back in the day. This page is an advert for a competition in N64 Magazine, back in '98. It's all about winning an N64 and a copy of Quake. Remember Quake on the N64? Bit of a big deal at the time, proper scary for console gamers. The competition is a bit of a laugh. They reckon they want to be scared witless by readers, to give them their daily adrenaline buzz. Bit dramatic, aren't they? They reckon Quake did the job, talking about nightmares, and needing relaxation sessions involving Disney videos after playing it. They're asking readers to send in ideas to scare them. Anything goes, as long as it's within reason. They mention other games like Doom and Turok being creepy and bloody, and even have a dig at Yoshi's story, saying the nasty shy guys transport our hero to their misty castle. Bit harsh on Yoshi, wasn't really supposed to be scary, was it? Care D. There's a screenshot of the game with a shambler, that classic Quake monster, with a speech bubble saying, "I'm gonna take you to a place. A whole world of hurt, boy." Bit cheesy now, but it probably had us bricking it back then. They even mention getting ruthlessly gibbed by the first shambler they encountered. The joys of early 3D shooters on console. Annie. Basically, it's all just hyping up Quake and getting readers to send in scary ideas to win a console and the game. Good times. This page from N64 Magazine, right, it's a bit of a laugh, asking readers to try and scare the staff. They're all acting like they're tough as nails, saying spiders and rats don't bother them, and definitely not anything you'd find on the side of the motorway. They're being all dramatic, saying they don't want any snotballs or anything dodgy sent in, like anyone would actually do that. The prize for whoever manages to give them the biggest fright is a shiny new N64 console and a copy of Quake. Quake on the N64, blimey, that was a bit of a conversion, wasn't it? Still, Quake was the big first-person shooter back then, proper PC classic coming to consoles. Pretty cool at the time. 9 runners-up also get a copy of Quake, which is generous. To enter, you've got to send something that will scare them witless to an address at N64 Magazine in Bath. Simple as that. There's a few rules, like no multiple entries, and if you work for the magazine or know someone who does, you can't enter. The closing date is July 1st, and they reckon the winners will be in the August issue probably. If you want your entry back, you need to include postage. And of course the editor's decision is final, don't mess with him. Yeah, typical magazine competition stuff really, but with a bit of daft humor thrown in. Good times. This page right then, it's all about Yoshi's story for the N64. Seems they're doing a bit of a guide on how to get through it, calling it a Yoshi extravaganza no less. They're talking about Goomba stomping, and Cloud Gym bashing, which sounds like your usual Mario type antics, and dealing with the booze, so yeah, typical Nintendo stuff. Apparently it came out in March, and they reckon it might not be one of Nintendo's best ever, but it's got its fans. They're promising a guide to help you with melon hunting, and keeping the super happy tree safe. Which sounds a bit daft really, but that's Yoshi for you, isn't it? Visually it's got a load of Yoshis in all sorts of colours piled up. Looking a bit chaotic. There's some fruit floating about apple, banana, grapes and watermelon, and even a question mark block like out of Mario, and a bomb character lurking there as well. It's all quite bright and colourful, typical N64, isn't it? They mention they reviewed the PAL version of Yoshi's story in issue 15, so this must be issue 16. Fair enough. This page from N64 Magazine is having a look at controlling Yoshi. Not that it's exactly rocket science, but they reckon they've got some tips beyond just reading the manual. First up is hunting high and low, which is about looking up and down with the analog stick, apparently useful for finding secrets. Then there's jumping, and well, it says jumping height depends on how long you hold the button. Groundbreaking stuff there. Bouncing is next, which is about bouncing off enemies by fluttering above them and landing on them while holding A. Seems a bit fiddly but could be useful. Fluttering is described as essential, using the flutter jump to clear gaps and reach high platforms, and you can even combine it with analog stick for extra height. Repeated fluttering is about tapping A again if your flutter runs out, which sounds obvious but hey, maybe someone needs telling. Go further is about getting a burst of speed after a high flutter jump by holding B in the analog stick, especially for the melon popping subgame they mention, reminding me of Yoshi's Island on the SNES, but they point out the flutter jump is different in this game and you can't just hold B for fruit. Sniffing is apparently key to becoming a master of the melon hunt. It's about Yoshi sniffing out coins, hearts and platforms. They say an exclamation mark appears when Yoshi sniffs something good, and he gets more excited as you get closer to buried treasure, which you reveal by pounding the ground or throwing an egg. Eggs is about using eggs you get from enemies, saying they're good for hitting egg boxes, and you can determine where they land, which is helpful for hitting things on the other side of boxes, useful occasionally they say. Invincibility talks about 2 types, traditional stars and hearts. Stars give you a second of invulnerability, standard platform affair. Hearts parachute down after eating 6 of the same fruit, giving you 10 seconds of invulnerability, and you can even bottom slam to turn enemies into fruit tasty. Finally, using eggs reminds us eggs only go as far as the cursor. Good for hitting multiple enemies if you position it right. They explode too, and the explosion radius depends on your happy level, so be super happy for maximum effect, meaning full health. Right then, Yoshi tips. All pretty straightforward really, but maybe helpful for some. This page in N64 Magazine is giving us some general tips for Yoshi's story, which, let's be honest, you probably needed back in the day. It was a bit of a strange one. They're calling it General Hints to Master the Basics, as if we were all struggling with a Yoshi game. Right, so first up is Shy Guys. Apparently if your health is low, pounding the ground near them could be useful. Not sure I ever relied on that trick to be honest, but hey, maybe someone did. Then there's Bubbles. Quick tips they say. If you're out of eggs, apparently jumping on bubbles makes them. Who knew? And if a bubble is over a gap, watch out, your fruit might get lost. They suggest pushing it across the gap, which sounds a bit fiddly, but alright. Warrant. Goomba Stomp is next, reminding us of the old Super Mario on the SNES trick of stomping Goombas without touching the ground, the old bounce maneuver they call it. Apparently you get a load of points for doing this on multiple enemies, so maybe worth the effort. Lakitu just eat him or use his cloud to skip bits, or look for secrets in the sky nearby. Fair enough, Lakitu's always been a pain. Bone Dragons, simple, stand under their head and chuck eggs upwards. Makes sense. Bees walk past them slowly, or hold R to run fast and they won't notice you. One of those weird game logics, but if it works, it works. Umbrella, they are saying don't bother using it for coins or fruit, just flutter. Apparently Yoshi can't take damage from falling, which seems a bit obvious really, doesn't it? Boo Family, they say hold down on the analog to raise them to the ceiling and then just walk past. Sneaky. Tiny Eggs, this is a bit of a weird one. Go to stage 43, get shrunk by a piranha plant, collect eggs, and they stay tiny even when you go back to normal size. Apparently they still have the same power as before. Bit of a novelty I suppose. Lastly, Poochie the dog. If he's around there's guaranteed treasure. Always good to have Poochie about then. And there's a bit about letters. Apparently, in the US/UK versions there are letters, and if you put them in order they spell out a sentence, you are Yoshi's great partner. Well, isn't that nice to know? A bit cheesy, but it's Yoshi's story after all. This page in the mag is all about bosses in games, specifically for Yoshi's story on the N64, back in '98. It's got a feature called Bosses, clever name, and it's giving tips on how to beat some of the big baddies in that fluffy Yoshi game. First up is Cloud N. Candy, a boss from World 31, apparently just a big bit of candy floss. The advice is pretty straightforward. Wait for it to land, and then just lick it with Yoshi's tongue. Apparently it gets faster as it shrinks, so you've got to be quick. Not exactly rocket science, is it? Guru. Then there's Don Bongo from 34, who looks like some sort of fruit-obsessed ape. The tip here is to feed him 30 bits of fruit with eggs to make him easier, and then aim your eggs at his top lip when he gets close. Apparently you need to avoid bits of trash he throws. Sounds charming. There's a mini-boss Slug, creatively named Slug, which takes 3 eggs to deal with. Apparently it hates bright light, so you're supposed to aim your egg cursor just in front of it, to use the blast to hurt it. Easy peasy, as they say. Next we have Inviso from level 32, who's an invisible irritant apparently. To deal with him you have to jump on the roof of the house in the background, because why wouldn't you? Then you're told to watch the screen and spot the light refracting, and then eat the flying chickens and shoot eggs at Inviso. Sounds a bit convoluted, even for a Yoshi game. Diabriyasad. Cloudjin from 33 is described as trickier, because of the platforms and spiked balls and his fiery breath. The advice is to chuck an egg at him after his little speech, and then hide behind an egg box on the left. You collect eggs, and then shoot him when he gets closer. 3 hits and he's done for. Warinsta. Finally, there's Baby Bowser, the final boss, labeled as the hardest boss in the game, with a bit of sarcasm thrown in as if to say, don't get your hopes up. You can either shoot the ceiling with eggs or bombs to knock him down, or use the blast radius of an egg. You need to position the cursor just before him when he leaps back up, and apparently, hearts are useful. Infinite eggs after eating hearts, good to know. There are also a few little side notes. One about a white shy guy, who appears if you lose a Yoshi on some levels, and you can get him back if you finish the level without dying. Another one about getting a different ending if you collect 30 melons on each level, and it even gives you a suggested level order to make it easier. There's also a random bit about changing the music in trial mode, and asking if anyone can identify the tune, bit of a filler question if you ask me. Lastly, there's a camera change tip for the level select screen, where you can use the C buttons to move the camera around, and R and Z to zoom in and out. Warrington Norsa. All in all, it's a pretty standard tips page for Yoshi's story. Not exactly groundbreaking stuff, but helpful enough if you were stuck on any of these bosses back in the day. This page is all about getting a top score in Yoshi's story on the N64. Remember that one? Cute game, a bit on the easy side maybe, but still, getting a high score is always a laugh. Remember that? So the magazine reckons you should pick your Yoshi based on the daily lucky fruit to max out on melons. Right then, melons are key. Apparently you've got to grab all 30 per level. Use Yoshi's sniff ability to find them all. Even the sneaky ones hidden in the grass or in boxes. Sub-games are also melon hotspots, it seems. Hearts are important too. Collect all 3 for bonus points, but keep track yourself because the game won't tell you how many you've got on the pause screen. Coins, well, yeah, collect every single one, obvious really. They might only be worth a point each, but every point counts if you're chasing a high score, doesn't it? Enemies. Now here's a trick. Don't just eat them, stomp on them for more points. And if you change their color to match your Yoshis before stomping, even better. Apparently if there's a bunch of the same colored Shy Guys, you can get massive points by stomping them all in a row. Who knew? Warrington. They also say don't lose a life for a 100-point bonus per Yoshi left at the end of each level, which is decent. And obviously double check each level to make sure you haven't missed any coins or Shy Guys. Yay! Then there's a table of target scores for different levels, and a main game score to beat of 34,848. Looks like a challenge for the completionists out there. Good luck to them, I say. Might give it a go myself later, see if I can beat their scores. Why not? This page is part 2 of the walkthrough for Mystical Ninja starring Goemon, picking up where they left off last month. They're on about dyeing your hair blue and using your chain pipe to get you in the mood, very Goemon. This section's about heading back to Zazen Town. You need to use Yae to call up a dragon and then get back to town. Find your way through platforms and doors. Then you'll bump into a young chap and end up in a desert. One of the screenshots shows a little character called Dancing All Night. They couldn't resist a pun there. And another shot of Yae, who they seem to be quite taken with, calling her a green-haired Lara Croft alternative, and suggesting she has a fan club. Calm down, lads. Oh, and there's a note about a locked door that'll need Sasuke's magic later. This page from N64 Magazine, yeah, I remember these. It's a how-to guide, classic stuff, for back then when we were all still figuring out these new 3D games. Looks like we're in the thick of Mystical Ninja starring Goemon. It's a hazza. Right at the top, it's telling you to get your map out, proper adventuring stuff. Then it's all about getting through the Festival Temple Castle. Seems like your typical Japanese castle level, you know the drill. Avoiding samurai geezers, barrels rolling at you, those were always a pain. Swimming around, diving in water, all a bit of a faff really, but part of the charm, innit? Worry. They're on about finding Sasuke's firecracker bomb early on, and later Sasuke's kunai of severe cold. Sasuke, bless him, a robot ninja who needs batteries apparently, kerosene indeed. They make a point of the kunai freezing red-hot blocks, which sounds like a puzzle element. And then there's Ebisumaru getting a meat saw hammer, sounds delightful. Apparently you can bop enemies for health dumplings with that, which is novel. Ah, and the screenshot of the ladders. Ladders, eh? Where would we be without them? Yeah, very true, you'd be stuck, wouldn't you? Profound stuff from N64 Mag as usual. Maka. Then it wraps up with the ghost robot Chirami boss fight. Says she's not that nasty really, just run around in circles, throwing red bolts back at her. Sounds a bit basic for a boss fight to be honest, but maybe it's harder than it looks. They reckon the game gets even weirder afterwards with the Peach Mountain villains. Well, that's Gosmon for you, always a bit bonkers. Good times. This page from N64 Magazine, bless it, looks like it's diving into walkthroughs for some quirky Japanese-themed game. We're talking about Kyushu Disappears, which sounds a bit dramatic, doesn't it? Apparently you're heading through caves and across bridges, and something about Ebimaru and evil shoguns. Very mysterious. Then we're on to Zazen again, which involves using Koryuta to get back to Zazen Town. There's talk of Sasuke's firecracker bombs to break into cracked doors, very 90s action game stuff. And you have to shrink Ebimaru to grab a fortune doll, before jumping in a lake and swimming for another one. Collecting dolls, classic. Next up, return to Oido Town. Here it seems you're trying to win Goemon's secret power game, balloon bursting apparently. You've got to dodge a fat doll girl, bit harsh, N64 Magazine, and push metal blocks around. Sounds like puzzle elements creeping in. And finally they mention howling wolves, and a chillier region of Japan. Spook, Dailyu. Lastly, Mutsu Festival Village. Ghosts are mentioned, naturally, because what's a good game without ghosts? You need to find Mokube's brother, to upgrade your weapons so you can smash blocks. Smashing blocks. Always satisfying in a video game. So, yeah, it looks like a guide for one of those slightly bonkers but charming Japanese games we used to get on the N64 back in the day. Probably quite fun, if a bit odd. This page is a how-to guide, typical sort of thing you'd see back then in N64 Magazine, helping you through a bit of a tricky spot in a game. Looks like it's for Mystical Ninja starring Goemon, that quirky Japanese adventure game on the N64. The section highlighted is called Gourmet Submarine Castle. Sounds a bit bonkers, doesn't it? It's giving you step-by-step instructions on how to navigate this underwater level. Loads of screenshots, a bit small and blurry as they always were in magazines back then, but you can just about make out what's going on. They're telling you to swim through a submarine, find Mr. Elephant, whoever he is, and then find a room with a lift. Apparently there's a tiny door, and you need to shrink Ebisumaru to get through it. Then it's all about finding keys, surprise packs, and dealing with robot fisticuffs. Seems like a proper maze. Those games could be right head-scratchers sometimes. One of the captions mentions, "Very Super Mario 64 feet about the submarine," a bit cheeky, probably referring to the graphical style or something. Another one says, "Gold key ahoy," jolly good, very British humour in there, bless them. They're even pointing out Ye's bazooka, which sounds like a right laugh, and mentioning mermaid magic power. It's all about getting through this castle, finding keys, and using Ye's mermaid form to get underwater. Essential stuff if you were stuck at this point in the game. Wouldn't want to be phoning Nintendo helpline back then. That was pricey. Good old magazine guides, they were a lifesaver, even if they did make you feel a bit daft for needing them in the first place. This page of the magazine writes, having a look at a few bits and bobs from games at the time, mainly focusing on Mystical Ninja starring Goemon, or Goemon Impact 2 as they've called the boss bit here, seems to be a guide to beating this robotic mermaid boss called Taizamba 2. Apparently it's not too hard if you just use Goemon's chain pipe to hook it and give it a good thrashing, or just blast it with the coloured balls it throws at you. Pretty standard boss tactics for back then really. Then we're onto a section called Zazen again. Always with the brackets, these magazines. This looks like a proper walkthrough bit. Seems like you're in Zazen Town and you need to chat to Benkai, who's the gatekeeper. Then you're off to find a water imp called Kihachi. Apparently, you need to find a small boy you've seen before, get some magic power for Sasuke, and then buy a quality cucumber from the priest's son for 800 Ryo. Blimey, cucumbers are pricey in Goemon's world. Sounds like you get a miracle snowflake, and then it's off to outer space, right then. Finally, there's Gorgeous Musical Castle. This section is about getting through the Shogun's base. Typical platforming stuff. Find keys, go through doors, jump over fans. They warn you to be careful of the fans folding up. Health and safety wasn't a big thing in these games though, was it? You gotta bounce on drums, cross platforms to get Mr. Elephant, whatever that is, and then use Mermaid Ye to swim underwater at the end. Gangplank of Doom or something, they say. Always a bit vague with these guides, weren't they? Still, probably enough to get you through if you were stuck back in '98. This page is from an old N64 mag, must be back in '98 sometime. It's a how-to guide for Mystical Ninja starring Goemon, or as we probably called it back then, just Goemon 64. Right then, so it's showing you how to get through the end bit of the game. Looks like Peach Mountain Shoguns is the level name. Jai Dai Dai. They are telling you to get a key, naturally, then head outside past some shops in a temple. Okay then. Apparently you need to find a wise man to upgrade your weapon so you can smash through a locked door. Sounds like typical Goemon madness. They're calling it the Shogun's Temple, so you're pretty far in. Gustao. Next bit talks about stairs, platforms and conveyor belts, red switches, all that platforming jazz. You grab a key, head down a slide, and you're back at the beginning apparently, and there's a gold fortune doll if you jump into a picture. Righto. Warrington Doku. Then it's more instructions about going up platforms to get another key, waves to watch out for, and cracking another door. They say you'll be back in the first room, which is where you need to go to reach the cylinder room. Blimey, cylinder room? Sounds a bit bizarre, even for Goemon. Final bit is about stairs again, going through doors, and being careful not to fall down gaps. Then you reach the platform to get the key. Apparently the Shoguns are in their inner sanctum, and they're going to brainwash you with a strange song and dance routine. Typical end boss stuff, innit? It's showtime, they're saying in big letters. Guriswa. So yeah, classic Goemon guide. Looks like the end of the game is a right old platforming puzzle as you'd expect. Happy days if you were stuck, eh? Probably would have been tearing your hair out otherwise. And that's it. Or is it? Cheeky. Leave it up to us to figure out if Goemon can resist the disturbing charms of the Peach Mountain Shoguns. Right then. The next page we've got here is from N64 Magazine, issue 16. It's a how-to guide, this time for Quake on the N64. It's all about finding every last secret in the game, labeled as part 1, so there's more to come then. Apparently if you've been riding too many rockets or accepting too many shafts, bit cheeky, that N64 magazine is here to help you salvage some pride. Bit dramatic in it? Vukesu. They reckon there's nothing more irritating than finishing a level in Quake and knowing there's a secret you missed, tucked away in some obscure location. They'd rather sniff itching powder than leave a stone unturned in the quest for quaking glory, whatever that is. It's supposed to be a no-holds-barred guide to uncovering all the secrets, in the spirit of freedom, adventure, and the N64 way. Right then, down at the bottom, it mentions that they started battling with Quake back in issue 12, and there was a full review in issue 15. So they've been banging on about Quake for a few issues now, haven't they? This page is all about finding the secrets in Quake on the N64. Remember Quake? Good times. Seems like they're giving us a guide to all the hidden bits in the first few levels. First up is Slipgate Complex, level 1 apparently, and it's got 5 secret areas. For the first one, they're telling you to hop up onto a ledge right at the start and shoot a panel to get some shells. Secret Area 2 involves shooting a grunt and his dog, jumping in the river and swimming through a tunnel for a health boost. Bit obvious really, those water tunnels usually had something. Secret Area 3, you're meant to go into the main building, face the TV screen and shoot a pillar to get onto a ledge and grab a quad damage. Now that's useful. Area 4 is about shooting a red button on a wall above some slime, and then diving into it to find a double-barreled shotgun. And finally, Secret Area 5, press 3 red buttons, collect a biosuit hidden behind a pillar in some slime, jump in again and swim to the deepest bit to find the last secret. Sounds like a lot of faff, for not much reward if you ask me. Next level down is Castle of the Damned, with 3 secrets. Secret Area 1 is just jumping into the water under a walkway, swimming back and going up a ramp for health and ammo. Pretty straightforward. Secret Area 2 involves going back in the water, swimming through a passage to the left, dropping down a panel, and looking out for flying grenades from ogres. Sounds a bit risky for a secret area. Then there's a silver key, which isn't really a secret but you need to get it to progress anyway. They tell you to get it before Area 3. Area 3 is opposite the silver door. You spot a brick sticking out of a pillar, press it, and it opens up to a quad damage and the way to the silver door, dealing with hellspawn along the way. Again, quad damage seems to be the prize for everything here. Hesse. Last level they're covering is Necropolis, also with 3 secrets. Secret Area 1 is after the first room, go right, follow the path, gibbing zombies of course, until you get to a watery cavern. Grab a gold key, go to a spot between 2 walkways, sink into the water, swim to a cave, and get a Ring of Shadows. Ring of Shadows, not bad. Secret Area 2, you go back the way you came, take an elevator up, kill more zombies, jump down and shoot a wall behind an ammo crate for another secret area. Leave via a lift for some armor. And lastly, Secret Area 3. Go back to the start, go to the large door, pick up something, shoot a symbol on the door to open a staircase. Press buttons on platforms, kill ogres, get armor, teleport through a wall, and you'll land on one of the ogre platforms. On the second platform, shoot the wall on the right to reveal the entrance to level 7. Teleport to level 7 from level 3? That's quite a secret, I suppose. Right then, secrets of Quake all wrapped up. Back to fragging. This page is about getting through some of the trickier bits in Hexen on the N64. Right, Gloom Keep, level 4, they reckon it's where things get a bit maze-like and booby-trapped. Typical for Hexen, really. They even joke about people brought up on Doom and Hexen being better prepared for it. Cheeky. Apparently if you bump into one of those shambler beasties, you should leg it, which is always good advice in Hexen, frankly. Then they run through 5 secret areas in Gloom Keep. Proper little sneaky bits they are, involving underwater caves, jumping onto ledges, and headbutting torches. Classic Hexen puzzle solving. There's even a silver key to find, which you'll need, naturally. Level 5 is the Door to Katon, and apparently it's rammed with ogres. Nice. They're focusing on finding the last couple of secrets in this level, and there's a guide for 4 secret areas this time, involving shooting symbols, sliding walls, and teleporters, the usual tricks. Finally, level 6 is the House of Quathon, and get this, no secret areas in big letters. Bit of a letdown after all that secret hunting, eh? But they do give you the lowdown on how to defeat Kathon himself, the big boss. Sounds like you just have to keep moving, trip some switches, and cook him with electrodes. Challenging? Pah! They're not wrong there. Bit of a pushover for a final boss if you ask me, but still, satisfying to finally put him down. All in all, a handy guide for getting through those levels in Hexen, back when you actually needed a magazine to figure these games out. This page from the magazine is all about finding those sneaky secret areas in Quake 64. Blimey, remember spending hours trying to find every last one of these back in the day. This guide is covering levels 7, 8, and 9. Level 7, Ziggurat Vertigo sounds a bit dramatic, doesn't it? They're talking about low gravity messing with your rocket launcher aim. Proper nightmare that was. Secret Area 1 is in the pyramid at the start for some armor and a pentagram of power, always handy. Secret Area 2, you need to find 3 Q symbols to get the silver key. Seems a bit of a faff, but worth it for that quad damage they mention. Then it's on to level 8, Ogre Citadel. They reckon it's simple layout, but you'll still get blown up by grenades. Secret Area 1 is down in the moat, which is a classic Quake move in it. Secret Area 2 involves wandering around until you find some steps. Sounds straightforward enough. And then they're on about getting the gold key by following doors and passages, ending up in a hole in the wall with a button. Bit of a trek just for a key. Bit of a trek just for a key. Melee. Finally, Level 9, the Crypt of Decay's lovely name. Apparently this is where you find the Dark Knights, those fireball-lobbing blighters. Secret Area 1 is down in the moat again, through a tunnel and a door. Secret Area 2 is to the left of a bridge, fighting zombies on a platform. Secret Area 3 involves backtracking to the bridge and going through a booby-trapped door. And Secret Area 4, well, that's not just a secret area, but a whole secret level. Sounds like a proper mission to get there, involving shooting buttons on ceilings and underwater grates. Typical Quake, eh? Always hiding something just out of reach. This page from N64 Magazine is giving us the lowdown on secret areas in Quake 64, which was quite the looker back in the day on the old N64. First up, Level 10, the Wizard's Mancy. It's a straightforward level apparently, but they point out two secret areas. Secret Area 1 involves jumping into the water near a column, finding a lift and getting some ammo. Always welcome. Secret Area 2 seems a bit more involved. You have to navigate around, find a button, take a submarine, get a gold key, and shoot a wall to reveal a red armor. Red armor, now that's proper. Warrington North. Then we move on to Level 11. The Dismal Oubliette. Sounds cheerful, doesn't it? Again, two secret areas. Secret Area 1 is all about pentagram symbols, pressing switches and jumping in pools to get a quad damage power-up. Quad damage? Lovely stuff for blasting Strog. Secret Area 2 in this level requires you to hit switches and shoot a corner wall to reveal a staircase to another secret area. Bit of a puzzle box, that one. Strog. Finally, Level 12, the Under-Earth. Small but dangerous apparently, with slime and spike traps. They highlight two secret areas here as well. Secret Area 1 is in a tunnel in the water. Press a brick on the right to get quad damage again. Seems to be giving quad damage away like sweets in this game. Secret Area 2 involves getting a gold key, going through a gold door, dropping into slime on the right side of a walkway, stepping back to get a biosuit and then standing in the center of the room to sink into a secret area. A biosuit, handy if you're messing about in slime. Deyale. So there you have it, secret areas for 3 levels of Quake 64, all helpfully explained in N64 Magazine. Good for finding all those goodies and showing off to your mates you knew all the hidden bits. This page from N64 Magazine is having a look at converter carts. Ah, the days of import gaming. You'd read about some must-have title, maybe something like 64 or Sumo getting a massive score, or even the bizarre Tamagotchi world, and then realize we'd be waiting forever in the UK, if it even bothered to show up. 1080 snowboarding was always a classic example of that. They're explaining the whole PAL versus NTSC thing, which was a right pain if you just wanted to play games from Japan or America. Apparently, these converter carts were supposed to be the answer, letting your PAL N64 play those foreign games. There's a table here listing a bunch of games, like Star Fox 64, Yoshi's Story, Mario Kart 64, SimCity 2000, and even GoldenEye, showing which ones were meant to work with these carts. It all seemed a bit of a faff, to be honest, but if you were really desperate to play those import games before anyone else, and without getting a funny black and white picture, a converter cart was probably your best bet. This page in the magazine is all about converter cartridges for the N64. Remember them? Basically, if you were a bit of a cheeky sort and wanted to play games from America or Japan on your UK N64, these were supposed to be the answer. It explains that these little gadgets slot into your N64, and then you plug your import game into that, along with a key cartridge, which was needed to trick the console into thinking it was all legit. Apparently Nintendo weren't too chuffed about these things, and they were always trying to update their consoles to block the latest versions of converters. A bit of an arms race, really. The article reckons the good thing about them is that they mostly give you a proper full-screen picture, unlike some of the dodgy PAL conversions we used to get, with the borders and slower speeds. They even mention games like ISS-64 and GoldenEye working well, which were must-haves back then. It also says you could use a PAL game as the key if you were playing an American game, or vice versa. Downsides though, apparently they could be a bit hit and miss with compatibility, and not many high street shops stocked them because Nintendo weren't keen. Also, some games that used the cartridge memory for things like high scores or ghosts, like Mario Kart 64 and Snowboard Kids, could have their data wiped if you used them as the key cart. That's a bit rubbish if you're trying to beat your best time on Rainbow Road. Chaos. There's a bit about damage and warranty suggesting Nintendo might say using these voids your warranty, but the magazine guys hadn't had any problems. The advice for buying one is to check if it works with the games you want, and maybe try before you buy, especially if you're ordering online. There's a picture of Mario from Mario 64 looking a bit squashed, saying it's letterboxed by the converter, which doesn't look ideal. And another screenshot from a snowboarding game, looks like 1080 degrees maybe? They're another screenshot to illustrate something about ghosting, but the magazine's screenshot program couldn't show it properly. They reckon the 1080 degrees converter is a decent bet for the time, but it all sounds a bit risky and potentially expensive, especially when you could just end up buying an American console instead. Good luck if you're trying to get your money back if it doesn't work, they say. Cheeky! This page in N64 Magazine, right, it's all about playing those import games on your N64 because back then it was a bit of a faff, wasn't it? They're looking at two main gizmos, the Blaze Universal Adapter, and some dodgy sounding thing called the Rainbow Converter. There's this table showing how well a bunch of games work with these converters and also with Diddy Kong Racing and Snowboard Kids. For some reason, maybe as a benchmark, games like Star Fox, 1080 Snowboarding, Yoshi's Story, Mario Kart 64, Sim City, Blast Corps, remember that one from Rare, NBAITZ, GoldenEye of course, San Francisco Rush, Pilot Wings 64, and Mario 64. Looks like some games had screen borders, ghosting, or sound issues depending on the converter. They reckon all the games ran at the proper speed, which is good, and Mario Raceway and Mario Kart was even a bit faster on import. Apparently 1080 Snowboarding had some trouble with the rainbow thingy. Then they review the rainbow converter itself, sounds a bit cheap and cheerful, made in China, bit dodgy, you have to ram the cartridges in, but it does work with import games mostly, except maybe 1080 again, which is a bit temperamental. Costs about 15 quid, J-Dulce. Next up is the SFX Universal Game Adapter, which they reckon is better made and the one to go for. Same price, £15. They reckon it's more stable, and works with pretty much everything, including Diddy Kong Racing, which is a plus apparently. Looking ahead, they're saying the big games like F-Zero and Zelda, the proper system sellers, will need converters to play if you import them, obviously. They also mention International Superstar Soccer 98, the Japanese version, saying it's just as good as the European one, but with the proper FIFA license, which is a big deal for footy games. Finally, there's a bit explaining PAL and NTSC, the telesystems, and why you need these converters in the first place to play games from America or Japan on your UK telly. It's all a bit technical about lines and hertz and whatnot, but basically, different telesystems, different games. Simples, really. This page of the magazine is all about tips and cheats for a few games, proper old school stuff from back in '98. We're starting with NFL Quarterback Club 98, which I remember, bit of an American football game. Never really took off massively over here, but hey, it was on the N64. There's a few cheat codes listed. If you wanted your players to zoom around, you could enter CRLLWY6 for maximum speed. For launching the ball miles, SPRBGRMS gives you super strength. There's a funny one about Sharon Davies, remember her, the swimmer? Apparently BGSPRVDV lets you dive further in the game, which is a bit random. LLFFSCK makes it easier to score, and there are speed boost and no tackles tips too, just mashing buttons and entering NBCTCKLS if you are struggling. Moving on, there's Duke Nukem 64, now that's more like it. Proper shooter that was. There's a tip for beating the Cycloid Emperor, the final boss, saying to grab loads of health and then dodge his breath while blasting him from the seats. Sounds about right for Duke Nukem. And if you wanted to fly around forever, turning on the all items cheat code in the menu gives you unlimited jetpack fuel. Simple as that. Lastly, there's GoldenEye 007, of course everyone had GoldenEye. This one is about unlocking classic characters, they're calling it Golden Oldie. It's a bit of a button pressing sequence holding L and R and pressing the C buttons and D-pad in a certain order. Quite fiddly really. If you manage it, apparently you can unlock Mishkin or Moonraker Elite to play as in multiplayer. Remember trying to figure these codes out with your mates, good times. There's screenshots of the character select screen with question marks, and then the unlocked characters like Jaws and Baron Samedi, all the classic Bond villains. Yeah, those were the days, cheat codes in magazines for your N64 games. Simple pleasures. This page is a right blast from the past, isn't it? It's the reader's top 10 tips section from N64 Magazine, and it's crammed full of little nuggets of wisdom sent in by us lot. They were giving away a Macopad, one of those third-party controllers, for the best tip, and a pin badge for everyone else, cheeky sods. Looking at the tips, they're covering a proper mix of games. First up is Snowboard Kids, with a code to unlock all characters and levels. Bet that was a lifesaver back in the day. Then there's a couple of FIFA 98 tips, one for getting your keeper to punt the ball further upfield, and another one about editing player names to make your player jump higher. Always wondered if that actually worked. Next up is NFL Quarterback 98, with a tip about making the players look all tall and skinny. Sounds a bit daft really. Then it's GoldenEye 007 of course, with a trick to speed up your pistol shots, essential for multiplayer deathmatches down the school. There's another FIFA 98 tip about diving being a foul, which is hardly groundbreaking stuff. After that it's Olympic Hockey Nagano 98, with some sort of code to unlock fighting in the options. Bit violent for the Olympics maybe? Then we've got Duke Nukem, with a tip about getting invincibility by messing about on the main menu, and another one about getting health back from fire hydrants and toilets. Duke was always a bit crude. Finally, there's Diddy Kong Racing with a tip about reversing off-ramps. Never really got the hang of that game myself. At the bottom there's a bit where you could send in your own tips using a form, asking for the game name and your tip, with space for your name and address. Good times, simpler times really. Just shows how eager we were for any edge we could get in these games back then. This page is from N64 Magazine, back in the day when the Nintendo hotline was about as useful as a chocolate teapot, so you had to rely on mags like this for your gaming secrets. Ikei no. It's all about cheat codes and tips here. First up, it's 1080 degrees snowboarding, remember that one? They reckon they've been playing it all month and are quite enjoying falling over with the lights off, menacing anyone who comes near, which sounds about right for a typical gaming session back then. They've got tips for unlocking different characters in 1080. To get Iceman you need to beat the expert match race and defeat him on Deadly Fall. For Gold Iceman you have to do the same thing but as Iceman himself. Bit of a grind that. Then there's Panda Man, unlocked by entering your initials on every single record screen, which sounds like a right pain. Finally the Penguin Board, which is probably the silliest one. You have to do every trick in training mode with Rob Hayward and Akari Hayami, and then do some button combo to get it. Sounds like a lot of faff for a penguin snowboard. Far more. Then it's on to Quake 64, the N64 version of the classic shooter. They're calling it Scary Old Quake, which is maybe a bit dramatic. Apparently there's a cheat to get a debug menu by entering QQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQQqu Options, the debug menu will be at the top. Classic cheat code trickery from back in the day. You had to try these things out to believe them. Warrant Norsa has May Warrant. There are screenshots from 1080 degrees. Snowboarding showing the gameplay, and some character art of the snowboarders, looking very 90s, and a big picture of a shambler from Quake 64, looking as terrifyingly low poly as ever. All in all, a typical tips page from an old N64 mag, full of stuff you probably wouldn't bother with now, but was gold dust back in '98. This page takes you right back, doesn't it? It's the old Nintendo hotline from N64 Magazine. Remember those? If you were properly stuck on a game, you'd give them a ring. Here they're advertising their service, boasting about expert staff for all your Nintendo needs, 7 days a week, pretty much all day. They even mentioned doubling staff and weekend hours to keep up with demand, bless them. Apparently they were getting through over 2,000 calls a day. And check this out, they even had a new fully automated service back then. Imagine that, automated game hints in '98. Cost you 50p a minute though, blimey. But hey, help on the latest games 24 hours a day, that was something. The main thing here though is puzzle solutions for Tetrisphere. Proper head scratcher that game was, a bit of a departure from your usual Tetris, all in 3D. They're giving away the answers to puzzles 25 through 40, having done the first lot last month. It's all step-by-step instructions telling you which piece to grab and slide where. Looks like they're covering quite a few levels. Probably saved a few controllers from being launched at the telly back in the day, eh? This page from Club 64 in the magazine is a right laugh. It's the letters page in it, where readers write in about their gaming experiences, mostly with the N64 of course. First up, there's a bloke called Jose moaning about a freak show glitch in GoldenEye, where Bond ends up with 3 hands when you use a cheat to have 2 weapons at once. Classic GoldenEye, eh? Always finding some daft thing you could do. Ed, the editor, just replies, 3 arms, eh? Dry as you like. Dry as you like. Then there's another one titled Hideous Freaks, where Richard Anderson is on about some dodgy looking enemies in GoldenEye, like they're doing cartwheels and have extra limbs. GoldenEye was full of weird stuff like that, wasn't it? They probably just clipped through the scenery or something. Borrington Norson. Next up is Tom Christie, who's raging about a psychopathic freak in the bunker level of GoldenEye. Seems like this guard is invincible, even with the golden gun. Talk about tough enemies back then, eh? Ed's response is just 300 bullets, eh? Wow. Truly, GoldenEye is a game for freaks. With freaks. We didn't mean you were freaks. Ahem. Anyway, Forinsinorkus, Ed. Bit awkward but funny. Then Andy Stevens is having a go at Nintendo improper version, complaining about them censoring games like Shadowman to make them kid-friendly. He wants adult games to be left alone. Fair point really, although back then they were probably just trying to not cause too much of a stink with the parents. The editor says fair point and then basically changes the subject to Duke Nukem 64, saying it's still a great game despite being cut down from the PC version. Subtle dig at Nintendo there. RT. Alex Hinchliffe is bit upsetting about spook memory cards being unreliable. Anyone remember those dodgy third-party memory cards? Always a gamble if they'd actually work. Ed basically says yeah, they are a bit pants and you're better off sticking to official Nintendo ones, even if they cost a bit more. Sound advice in the end. Lastly, Ross Grant's little eyeball letter is all about messing about with the Game Boy Pocket camera and printer. Remember that thing? Taking rubbish pictures of your mates and sticking them everywhere. He suggests pranking McDonald's staff, which is a bit cheeky. Ed ends on a bizarre note about Rare's dogs having a special secret smell and chewing your legs off if they appear, which is just pure magazine weirdness to finish things off. Mad times, eh? This page in N64 Magazine is all about readers' letters, a good old letters page. Right at the top we've got Dream On, which is where readers pitch their game ideas. First up is someone suggesting a Mario Golf game, but like Mario Kart, in 3D. Imagine that, eh? Wandering around the course and even Mario Kart races thrown in. Sounds a bit bonkers but could be a laugh. Then there's a weird one about being a lizard after losing a bet. Sounds like a proper adventure game, with death matches, puzzles and turning into animals. Quite imaginative, I suppose. Next section is Irish newspaper, where a reader from Ireland is asking about the 64 DD being released in Europe, and Zelda being delayed. They're worried about the PlayStation taking over. Seems like everyone was back then. The magazine reckons there's no word on the NTSC version of the 64 DD, let alone the PAL one, so basically, no one knows what's happening, typical Nintendo at the time. They also mention Miyamoto saying Zelda will be better than Resident Evil, and Final Fantasy VII, blimey AL ones, those were fighting words back then. Warrant. Then there's a serious complaint from a reader moaning about cheat codes for GoldenEye being wrong, and his name being spelt wrong too. Fair enough, I suppose. Getting the cheats wrong was annoying when you were stuck on a level for ages. Correction Corner is next, the magazine owning up to a few mistakes as usual. They said Super Mario RPG 2 wouldn't be released in the UK, but turns out it will be. Good news for role-playing fans if you were into that sort of thing on the N64. They also got a cheat code wrong for Diddy Kong Racing. It's Toxic Offender, not Toxic Offender, apparently crucial. And they messed up the location of a battle key in DKR2, Walrus Cove, Snowball Valley. Who can keep track? Finally, they mixed up screenshots of Pocket Monsters Snap and Pocket Monsters Stadium. Oops. Easy mistake to make. Those Pocket Monsters games were all the rage then. Lastly, the N64 board is showing off fan artwork pinned up in the office, like a real corkboard. There's mentions of Hugh Escott, Jacob Mowbray, Ross Holbrook, Aidan Connor, Stephen Cairns, Alan Glendinning, William Schutz all getting a shout out for their creations. Looks like they're really pleased with all the stuff readers send in. It's a bit of a community thing, which is nice. This page we've got the letters section, always a good laugh to see what folks were moaning about or praising back then. Someone's threatening their dad over not getting an N64. Bit dramatic, eh? Another one's mates are all getting N64s, except for one poor sod, stuck with a Saturn, remember those? Then there's a bit about Blastcore, which was alright I suppose, not mind-blowing but decent enough. And someone's on about a woolen needles pack, turning the N64 into a sewing machine, classic. Then there's a letter from someone down in New Zealand moaning about getting 1080 snowboarding late, typical PAL regions getting shafted again. Next up is a fact box about the 64DD, remember that thing? They were trying to tell us it was the future, a box that slotted under your N64 and used these special discs. Apparently they held loads more than cartridges, like 8 times as much as Mario Kart 64, which sounded impressive at the time. They were banging on about Zelda being massive and SimCity 64 being huge, cities that took days to explore, ambitious stuff for the N64. Said the discs were faster than CDs and writable, which was supposed to be amazing for loading times and creating your own stuff in F-Zero X and some other weird sounding programs. They were hoping it would be out by the end of the year in Japan. Typical Nintendo timeframes, always a bit vague. Finally, there's the invention corner. Someone's come up with a life or death pack, a controller add-on that shoots you with real bullets when you get hit in a game. Health and safety nightmare that. Wasn't going to fly. Then there's a N64 screen controller, a Game Boy slapped onto an N64 pad, for playing on the go apparently. Bit bulky looking, but I guess they were trying to solve the problem of playing N64 outside your living room, which was a bit of a first world problem back then, wasn't it? Still, inventive bunch, these gamers. This page is a bit of a mixed bag, innit? Over on the left, it's the "So Tell Me This" section, where readers are asking the magazine all sorts of questions, and these blokes with beards are giving them the answers. First up, someone's asking about the pocket camera and printer for the Game Boy. Apparently it's due out in July, but no one knows exactly how much it'll cost, but they reckon about 60 quid bundled together. Then there's a question about a Game Boy emulator. Seems there's this thing called Game Booster from Daytel already out for 40 quid, a reviews on page 14 apparently. Plays all Game Boy games apparently. Hey, someone else is moaning about GoldenEye, can you believe it? Saying they hate it, but the magazine just tells them they're wrong and to try again. Honestly, GoldenEye? Hating GoldenEye? Some people, eh? Worrying. Duke Nukem. Time to Kill is coming in November, and the N64 version is supposed to be totally different with extra levels set in London, which sounds a bit bonkers. Tim, bless him, reviews the football games and apparently gets right annoyed doing it. Wrestling games are being talked about. Looks like Iguana and EA are both doing WWF and WCW games. No Resident Evil on the N64 though, sadly. And someone wants a footy management game on the N64, which, yeah, would be good, wouldn't it? Then there's a bunch of questions about racing games. V-Rally 64, touring cars, F1. Looks like V-Rally 64 details are on the way. Touring cars on the N64? Not likely soon. Codemasters are doing F1 games, and there's talk of sensible soccer, and even a golf game on the N64. Someone else is asking about LucasArts games and Mario 64 too. LucasArts are working on Rogue Squadron and XWing, but no Mario 64 2 screenshots seen, sadly. Over on the right it's the front cover of the magazine, On Sale Now, the mag for blokes who love gadgets. Very much aimed at us blokes, this magazine. It's issue 21, June 1998. Got a blonde woman on the front holding a handheld telly thingy. Toys for the boys. Keep in touch. With some sharp touchscreen phone PDA thing. Up close and personal. With Japanese gadgets. Power hungry about batteries. Deeper on down about submarines. And turn on to digital TV. Looks like digital telly is the big thing this issue. Non-turnal. Inside the new issue, apparently there's an article about digital telly, a review of that sharp phone, a battery test, and stuff about Bond gadgets. Sexy gear from Japan, latest technology news, lifestyle hi-fis, deep-sea submersibles, superbikes and drag racing at Santapod. Blimey, bit of everything in there. And then right at the bottom there's a trial offer for 3 issues for £4.50, with a form to fill in if you're interested. Standard magazine stuff, really. This page then is having a good old think about what actually makes a game properly brilliant in it. They're banging on about graphics and gameplay, and also whether a game really makes the most of the N64. GoldenEye gets a massive thumbs up as an example, saying it's miles ahead, even compared to PC games like Quake. They reckon it's the little touches in GoldenEye that make it special. Of course, Mario 64 gets a mention as the big N64 game everyone loved back then, praising its freedom and comparing it to other 3D games that were trying to cash in on the same idea over on the PlayStation. They're name-dropping games like Croc and Busby 3D. Remember those? Bless them, they weren't quite Mario, were they? They also bring up Zelda 3 on the SNES, or SNES as some people called it, and GTI Club, as proper classic games. There's a bit about how some games, like Duke Nukem and Turok, are just about blasting everything in sight to get to the end, whereas GoldenEye is a bit more nuanced in its design. They even have a pop at San Francisco Rush's music, saying it was rubbish, but they still gave the game a decent score anyway. They touch on the fact that quite a few N64 games are updates of older games, like ISS 64 and Madden, or Lilac Wars, which was Star Fox on the SNES, but they reckon that's not necessarily a bad thing, and they have a bit of a laugh at Doom and Quake's graphics next to GoldenEye, calling them ugly, especially Quake even though it was 3D, still not a patch on GoldenEye apparently. There are pictures of Mario with a bow bomb, Croc, GoldenEye gameplay, a Mancubus from Doom and some monster from Quake just to illustrate their points. Basically, the gist is GoldenEye was just the king of the hill back then, no question. This page is about trying to figure out what makes a game actually good, not just technically impressive but properly enjoyable. It kicks off by saying games have gotten so visually complex since the old days, like comparing Pong to FIFA 98, which is a fair point. They're talking about how visuals are important, saying even a retro fan wouldn't say Donkey Kong on the SNES is visually as good as Mario 64, which again is obvious really. There's a picture of Donkey Kong there, looking a bit cheeky. And the North, they mention immersion being key, that feeling of being sucked into the game world, and give Cruisin' USA as an example of how not to do it. Apparently it's so bad it's like you crash into things that appear out of nowhere, and you're more aware of the TV and your surroundings than the game itself. They even joke about the kid next door eating your daffodils while you're playing. Bit harsh on Cruisin' USA maybe, but it was pretty ropey. Then it talks about that feeling of waking up after hours of playing a great game, and realizing how engrossed you were. They bring up Mario 64, GoldenEye, and Diddy Kong Racing as examples of good games that pull you in. They reckon good games should have a multiplayer mode, mentioning Mario 64 and Turok as examples that got top marks partly because of their multiplayer. They say playing against another person is always better than playing against the computer, which is definitely true for most games back then. There are screenshots dotted around. One for MK Mythologies with a comment about it being an atrocity, another for ISS 64, saying it's a sublime football game, and Mario Kart 64 mentioned as proof of Nintendo's multiplayer skill. And there's a bit at the bottom saying Diddy Kong Racing's multiplayer is bad because it lacks excitement, which seems a bit contradictory to mentioning it as a good game earlier. Maybe they mean it's not as good as the others. Overall, it's basically pondering what made some of those N64 games we were all playing at the time so addictive. This page from N64 Magazine delves into the realm of video game visuals, and whether graphics truly make a good game. It starts off by listing some visually impressive titles on the N64 like Super Mario 64, Pilotwings 64, GoldenEye, Wave Race 64, Diddy Kong Racing, ISS 64, and Lilac Wars. Good choices, I reckon. Solid games, all of them. Then it gets a bit sarcastic listing the ugliest games, covering your eyes stuff like Mahjong Master, Pachinko World 64, and Aero Gauge. Ouch, yeah, some of those weren't pretty to look at, were they? The article discusses how visuals are important because they communicate with the player, creating an environment for play. They touch on Mario 64 and its appeal, arguing it's not just good looking but brilliant in how it uses visuals for gameplay. It mentions active visual ingredients in games, explaining how games like Mario 64 let you interact with the environment and reward exploration, unlike some games with frustrating invisible walls. Remember those days? Doom 64 gets a shout out as an example of a game that avoids those pitfalls. There's a section on sprites, asking if they still have a role. They reckon digitized sprites from video footage like in Midway's Mortal Kombat games on the N64 look a bit ropey and detached from the backgrounds. Yeah, those MK-N64 ports weren't exactly arcade perfect, were they? Apparently MK Mythologies on the N64 is crap. Strong words. Finally, what makes for good visuals is discussed, with a point about technical accomplishment, like frame rate 30 FPS is considered comfortable. Seems low now, doesn't it? They also mention clipping and pop-up being bad, and techniques like fogging in Turok to hide draw distance. Then they talk about the artistic side of visuals, the visual finesse and art style, whether it's photorealism or cartoonishness, and how important artist skill is for creating a beautiful game. GoldenEye and Mario are mentioned again as standard bearers for good visuals, along with NFL Quarterback Club, Wave Race 64, and Pilotwings also getting honorable mentions for their looks. All in all, a decent summary of the visual side of gaming back in '98. This page in N64 Magazine back in June '98 is all about sounding games, right? It's titled Sound, nice and bold. They're kicking off with a list of games that have good music, things like Blast Corps, Diddy Kong Racing, GoldenEye. Everyone knew GoldenEye had cracking sound, then Lilac Wars, Yoshi's Island, Mario 64, and then a few others like Aero Gauge, Cruisin' USA, and some Japanese games I'm not too familiar with like Denryu Iraibu's, J-League Dynamite Soccer, and San Francisco Rush. Looks like they are rating them all out of 1 for some reason. The article starts by asking if sound makes a good game, and basically says yeah it does. They mention how music and sound can make an average game feel special. Think about it, would ISS 64 or FIFA 98 be the same without the crowd noise? Probably not, and Turok wouldn't be half as scary without those dinosaur thumping sounds, would it? There's a bit about the N64 being cartridge-based, and how everyone thought the sound would be rubbish compared to CD-BASED consoles like the PlayStation or Saturn. But they say Mario 64 actually has really good, context-sensitive music, mentioning a review from a previous issue about the beach level in Mario 64. They go on about how the music changes as you go from the beach to underwater to the cave, adding layers as you explore. Bit poncy, but fair enough, the music was good in Mario. Warrington. Then there's a question about whether games should have Chemical Brothers style soundtracks. Bit of a weird question, but they basically say no, most games just need music that fits the game, changes with the mood, like in films. They use Starsky and Hutch as an example, with those something's fishy tunes. Makes sense, really. Lastly, they talk about sound effects, using GoldenEye again, mentioning the silenced Walther PPK sound, the clink of ammo. They reckon sound effects are really important for making a game believable and immersive, like crashing your car in Multi-Racing Championship and hearing a clunk sound. They've got screenshots from ISS64, Diddy Kong Racing, Mario 64, and Yoshi's Story scattered around the page to illustrate their points. Yeah, good sound was definitely important even back then on the old N64. This page then, Mastery it's called, seems to be pondering what makes a game truly brilliant, like proper standout stuff. They've got a list of games they reckon are masters of their craft, proper N64 classics like Blast Corps GoldenEye, ISS64 the footy game, Lilac Wars that Star Fox 64 for us lot, Mario 64, Madden Mario Kart 64, Turok and Wave Race 64. Good solid games all of them, can't argue with that list really, proper bangers back in the day. Then there's a weird bit about games that have lost their way, like Wheel of Fortune, some Japanese puzzle game, and Pachinko World 64. Not sure anyone really missed those, to be honest. They're going on about whether games need to be original to be good, which is a fair point. Talking about how back in the Commodore 64 days games were always trying something new, unlike now where they reckon developers just churn out the same old formulas. They even mention the dreaded Mario or Sonic clone, which we all saw a fair bit of back in the 16-bit days, didn't we? GoldenEye gets a bit of a shout-out, saying it wasn't completely original, but it was a clever twist on the usual shooter, with a modern setting and recognizable faces, which was a bit different then. They reckon originality gets copied quickly, which is probably true, everyone jumping on the bandwagon if something works. Then it's asking how much mastery a game needs to be considered good, saying it's not just about being original, but also how polished the game is and the production values. They compare Diddy Kong Racing and Mario Kart 64, reckon DKR is better for multiplayer, and Mario Kart 64 is a bit weaker single player, which is a bit harsh on Mario Kart if you ask me, but each to their own. And IS-98 apparently is the best footy game ever at that point, bit of a bold claim, but it was decent. All in all, it's a bit of a think piece on what makes a game properly good, not just another clone. Makes you think back to those N64 days. Didn't half have some cracking games? This page in N64 Mag is having a bit of a ponder about game lifespan. You know, which games you keep coming back to and which ones gather dust after a week. They've got a list of games with good lifespan, the ones they reckon are revered and immortal. Bit dramatic, eh? Like 1080 Degrees, Snowboarding, Diddy Kong Racing, Duke Nukem 64, GoldenEye, ISS64 and blimey, all 9 Mario Kart 64 tracks and even Mario 64 itself. Then they've got a list of the poor sods, shot in the paddock, games that didn't last. Aero Gauge gets a 0, ouch. Clay Fighter 63 and a third gets a measly 1. Cruisin' USA, Nagano Winter Olympics and MK Mythologies, Sub-Zero also get a 0 each. Brutal. They're asking what makes a game last, going on about detail and secrets. Back then, on 16-bit, games were often just a bit of text after you finished. But Nintendo, bless 'em, they'd throw in a bit extra. Finish Zelda, and suddenly you're hunting for heart pieces, get to the end of Super Metroid and there's more hidden bits. They're saying N64 games are taking this to a new level, like Diddy Kong Racing is packed with stuff, and GoldenEye with its cheat menu and oddities. Warrington, they reckon secrets aren't just optional anymore, a good game needs them. Then they moan about Yoshi's Story being beatable in a day, even if it has some challenge and a point system. And they're asking if lifespan is just about difficulty and rewards. Apparently not. The easiest way to boost lifespan? 2-player mode. Simple as that. Multiplayer gaming, they say it should be taken as read for any game with competition. They're even wondering if Mario DD might have split-screen 2-player, with Mario and Luigi working together. And apparently Turok 2 will have multiplayer too. They're asking what more could a gamer want? A bit cheeky. Reader, readawin, rawore. What improves lifespan further? Readare, readawin, readare, readareware, Redario 64 gets a shout out for that. They're saying, if you get bored of collecting stars, you can just mess about on slides. And Pilot Wings gets a mention. Who needs Pilot Wings? They ask, sarcastically like. They say some games will always have lifespan, like races. But some, like MK Mythologies, where you're sidling like a crab and falling to your death, probably won't. Bit harsh but kinda true looking back. We've got screenshots dotted about, 1080 snowboarding looking pretty cool on the slopes, Pilot Wings showing off, Mario Kart 64, and Zelda. Naturally, they're always banging on about Zelda back then. Zelda this, Zelda that. They're wondering what Nintendo has in store for Zelda this time. Always building the hype, weren't they? Good times. This page is all about what's coming up in the next issue, number 17, of N64 Magazine. They're really pushing the boat out and saying they are traveling to the ends of the earth to bring us the latest on N64 games. Bit much, but alright. Alright, so first up, they're off to America to visit the E3 show in Atlanta, which was always a big deal back then. They're promising the latest on GoldenEye. Naturally, everyone was hyped for that. Then there's Legend of Zelda 64. Ocarina of Time, no introduction needed for that one. Massive game. Plus V-Rally 64, Mission Impossible, Turok 2, F-Zero X and Wipeout 64, and apparently surprise announcements. Blimey, sounds like they're covering everything. Then it's to Paris. Photonic Trouble never really took off that one, did it? And to Lyon, for Space Circus Infogrames game, remember them? And finally, to Warwickshire. Bit of a step down from Paris and Lyon, innit? But apparently it's to Tremble, and visit Rare again to play Banjo-Kazooie. Now Banjo, that was a proper game. And to Kazooie. Down the side there's an index for issue 16. Looks like the usual mixed reviews for games like Aero Fighters Assault and Air Borders 64, previews for Banjo-Kazooie, Buck Bumble, Deathmath South Park, Earthworm Jim 3D, F-Zero X, Gex 64, Pocket Monsters Stadium, Rat Attack, Rakuga Kids, Space Circus, Space Jelly, Taz 3D and 12 Tales, Conker 64. Bit of everything in there, some good, some not so much. There are also how-to guides on using a converter cartridge, completing Mystical Ninja, and finding secrets in Quake, which were always handy. Looks like there's even a bit about Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey and weird science. Remember that game? Chemistry of Great Games. Sounds a bit naff. At the bottom, under Plus, they're promising a second part of their Quake guide, Secrets for WCW vs NWO, a review of GT64. They said, this time definitely, which makes you wonder what happened before, and more new tips and cheats. Standard stuff for a mag back then, really. Apparently this well-traveled July issue of N64 Magazine was going to be on sale Thursday the 18th of June. Right then.